The galactic war between humanity and the insectoid ZZ-Glorg collective had raged for a century, consuming countless worlds in its insatiable hunger. No one spoke of anything else. Yet, whispered in the mess halls of weary soldiers from both sides, passed between ZZ-Glorg scouts over crackling comms, were rumors of an image, a single impossible depiction said to possess the power to halt the bloodshed. Douglas Brown, a man carved from the very stone of 1,000 battlefields, was stationed at Monitoring Outpost 14, a desolate scar upon the edge of known space. The wind howled a mournful dirge across the metal plating of the prefab structure, a sound that mirrored the emptiness in his gut. His duty, to scan the void for any sign of the approaching ZZ-Glorg. He ran the diagnostics again, the same readings he'd seen for the last 6 months. Nothing. Sector Gamma 9 remains a graveyard, he muttered into his comm, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. No new contacts. Requesting permission to initiate scheduled maintenance cycle. Scheduled maintenance cycle. It was code for staring into the abyss and wondering if there was any point. His reflection stared back from the darkened screen, a roadmap of loss etched onto his face. Another day, another void, he thought, the cynicism a familiar weight on his chest. Another day closer to the end, one way or another. The automated response crackled in his ear, granting permission. He powered down the console, the sudden silence amplifying the drumming in his ears. The silence always did that. He picked up his pulse rifle, the cold metal a comfortingly familiar weight in his hands. Ritual. He needed the ritual. Outside, the twin suns cast long, skeletal shadows across the rust-colored landscape. He patrolled the perimeter, his boots crunching on the loose shale. The wind whipped at his worn fatigues, carrying the scent of ozone and decay. A downed transport, a skeletal husk picked clean by scavengers, lay half buried in the sand a few hundred meters out. He made his way toward it, his senses on high alert. That's when he saw her. Huddled in the shadow of the transport's broken wing, a small figure barely more than a child, an Ithorian youngling. Her large, mournful eyes, too big for her thin face, darted nervously, reflecting the harsh sunlight. She was small, even for a youngling, her multi-hued skin stretched taut over fragile bones. Scraps of scavenged metal and cloth served as inadequate protection against the elements. Lita, if the faded markings on a piece of salvaged flight suit were to be believed. An orphan, clearly, scavenging for scraps like a desert rat. Douglas immediately tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards the sidearm holstered at his hip. Refugee? Maybe. Spy? Possibly. Either way, a complication he didn't need. He approached cautiously, his pulse rifle raised but not yet aimed. "Hey," he said, his voice rough, unused to gentle tones. "You stop right there." The youngling flinched, her entire body trembling. She recoiled, pressing herself further into the wreckage. A series of melodic chirps, almost bird-like, escaped her twin mouths, a desperate plea he couldn't understand. Her hands moved frantically, manipulating a salvaged piece of metal, creating shimmering visual displays, frantic images of her, running, hiding, explosions in the sky. Desperation made visible. Douglas activated his standard translator, holding it up between them like a shield. "Identify yourself," he commanded, his voice firm but not threatening. "State your purpose." The translator sputtered, its screen flickering erratically. Static crackled from its speakers. "Incompatible language matrix," a synthesized voice announced. "Ithorian pheromonal communication protocols not recognized." Frustration welled up inside him. Of course, nothing was ever easy. The Ithorian youngling, Lita, lowered the metal sheet, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Slowly, deliberately, she reached down and picked up a sharpened rock. With surprising dexterity, she began to scratch at the dusty ground. A flower bloomed in the dirt, not a flower he recognized. Its petals swirled with impossible colors, hues that shouldn't exist, radiating an ethereal light. The shapes were stylized, almost childlike, yet they conveyed a sense of vibrant, untamed life. An impossible flower in a graveyard. Despite his ingrained suspicion, something shifted within Douglas. He saw past the potential threat, past the strategic implications, and recognized the raw, desperate vulnerability of the child. A flicker of empathy, long dormant, sparked within the cold embers of his heart. He lowered his rifle slightly, though his grip remained firm. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a nutrient bar, its sterile packaging a stark contrast to the organic beauty of the drawing. He extended it towards her, his hand steady, his eyes watching her every move. "Here," he said, his voice softer this time. "Take it." Lita hesitated, her large eyes studying him with wary intelligence. She glanced at the nutrient bar, then back at his face, as if searching for a hidden motive. The wind whispered through the wreckage, amplifying the silence between them. Then, slowly, cautiously, she reached out and took the nutrient bar. Her fingers brushed against his, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through his calloused hand. She tore at the packaging with her small, nimble fingers and devoured the bar in a matter of seconds, her hunger a palpable thing. Douglas watched her, his expression unreadable. He knew he couldn't leave her here to die, but he also couldn't ignore the potential danger she represented. He made a decision, a hard one, but one he believed was necessary. "All right, kid," he said, holstering his weapon. "You're coming with me." He reached for her arm, his grip gentle but firm. "It's not a request." Lita didn't resist, but her eyes widened with apprehension. He could feel her trembling beneath his touch. He started to lead her back towards the outpost, the setting sun casting their long shadows ahead of them. He had no idea what he was going to do with her, but one thing was certain. His quiet, predictable existence was over. What he couldn't foresee was the path this youngling would set him on. Douglas guided Lita down the narrow corridor, his hand hovering near his sidearm. The spare room was little more than a storage alcove, cleared of its usual clutter, a few dented supply crates, a broken nutrient paste dispenser. He'd shoved them into a corner, trying to make the space less institutional. "Stay," he grunted, pointing to the small cot that folded down from the wall. He kept his tone neutral, hoping to project reassurance, though suspicion still gnawed at him. He turned and headed back to the comm station, the metal grating cold beneath his boots. He needed to report this. Now, he slapped the activation rune on the console, the familiar hum failing to materialize. Static crackled from the speakers. Damn it. Solar flare activity had been predicted, but he'd hoped they'd be spared the worst of it. He tried again, cycling through frequencies, each attempt met with the same frustrating silence. Frustrated, he kicked a loose panel, then sighed. No use getting angry at the equipment. It wasn't the equipment's fault the galaxy was at war. He rummaged through a stack of decaying datapads in a forgotten storage bin, coughing as dust billowed around him. Most were useless schematics and outdated regulations, but then he spotted it. A faded, pre-war guide to Ithorian culture and basic language. It was ancient, probably riddled with inaccuracies, but it was better than nothing. The translator he'd used earlier was clearly far too rudimentary to be of any real use. Back in the storage alcove, Lita was alone. He hadn't expected her to stay put, but there she was, crouched near the wall, her four mouths moving in a silent song. As he got closer, he saw what she was doing. The dull metal of the wall was covered in drawings, rendered in dust and grime. Crude figures, but undeniably figures of Ithorians, their hammerhead silhouettes unmistakable. She'd drawn a village, too, with the distinctive mushroom-shaped dwellings of her homeworld. The images were filled with a palpable sense of loss, a desperate attempt to recreate what was gone. He retreated and returned moments later, holding a battered sketchpad and a handful of colored pencils he discovered in a forgotten storage crate, relics from some long-ago initiative to boost morale. He knelt, extending the offering towards her. "Here," he said softly, as if approaching a skittish animal. Lita flinched, her large eyes darting between the sketchpad and Douglas's face. Cautiously, she reached out, her slender fingers brushing against his. The contact was fleeting, hesitant, but she took the pad and pencils. Her eyes widened, a spark of curiosity flickering within them. She began to draw, her hands moving with surprising speed and confidence. The images became more elaborate, more detailed. She depicted the war, the sleek, predatory ships of the Zglorg raining destruction upon her village. The mushroom houses were engulfed in flames, the Ithorian figures fleeing in terror. The drawing pulsed with raw emotion, a visceral depiction of trauma. Douglas studied her work, his gaze fixed on the recurring symbols and patterns. Circles within circles, crossed lines, swirling shapes. Could these represent specific words or concepts in Ithorian? He grabbed another sheet of paper and with clumsy fingers attempted to mimic some of the simpler symbols. He held up his drawing for Lita to see, trying to gauge her reaction. Her head tilted, her multiple eyes blinking in confusion. She reached out, her small hand gently covering his. With a surprising strength, she guided his hand, correcting the shapes, adjusting the angles. It was a hesitant collaboration, a fragile bridge forming between two vastly different minds. Suddenly, a klaxon blared, its piercing shriek echoing through the outpost. Red lights flashed, bathing the corridors in an ominous glow. Douglas swore under his breath. A radiation storm. He'd almost forgotten. He grabbed Lita's arm, pulling her to her feet. He pointed to the flashing lights, then to the ceiling, miming falling debris. He sketched a crude shelter on the sketchpad, underlining it emphatically. "Storm," he grunted, hoping she understood. "Inside, safe." Lita's eyes widened with fear. She pointed towards the ventilation system, her slender finger tracing a hairline crack in the wall. She shook her head vehemently, her multiple mouths emitting a series of soft, distressed clicks. Radiation. She was indicating a radiation leak. Douglas cursed. He hadn't checked the shielding in this section. He moved to the wall, running his hand along the cold metal. The crack was small, almost invisible, but Lita's heightened senses had clearly detected something. The outpost's radiation shielding was compromised. They needed to find a safer location. Quickly. "Come on," he said, grabbing her hand again. He led her towards the lower levels of the outpost, towards the reinforced storage bunker. It was designed to withstand heavy bombardment, hopefully offering better protection from the radiation. As they moved through the dimly lit corridors, the storm intensified. The outpost shook violently, metal groaning under the strain. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. They reached the storage bunker, its heavy blast door sealed tight. Douglas wrestled with the manual controls, throwing the locking mechanism just as a surge of radiation spiked the internal monitors. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, sealing them inside. The power flickered again, plunging them into near darkness. Only the faint glow of the emergency lights provided minimal illumination, casting long, distorted shadows across the bunker walls. They were trapped. The storm raged outside, its fury testing the limits of their refuge. Their fate hung in the balance, uncertain until the storm subsided. The Geiger counter clicked faster, a frantic rhythm against the oppressive silence of the bunker. Douglas stared at the flickering display, 37 rads. Climbing. He killed the power, plunging the room into deeper shadow. Numbers didn't need light to climb. He knelt by the meager pile of nutrient paste packets, counting them again. 7. 7 packets for 2 people. He glanced at the water recycler. The level was low, dangerously so. The storm outside showed no signs of abating. The groaning metal of the outpost was a constant reminder of its ferocity. Lita watched him, her large eyes reflecting the dim emergency light. She crawled closer, picking up a discarded piece of metal plating. With a shard of rock she'd somehow acquired, she began scratching at its surface. A minute later, she held it up for Douglas to see. It was a plant. a stylized, almost childlike depiction, but undeniably a plant. Radiating out from the leaves were jagged lines, which Lita highlighted with a darker scratch. Radiation. The plant was absorbing radiation. Douglas stared at the drawing, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, hope, igniting within him. He pointed to the drawing, then tapped his own head, trying to convey the concept. Then he began sketching in the dust on the floor a crude map of the outpost. He drew a box, labeling it with a shaky hand, Botany Lab. He circled it, then crossed it out, drawing a skull and crossbones. Danger. He pointed to Lita, then back to their current location, drawing a large X. Stay. Lita watched him, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head vehemently. She grabbed the rock shard and with furious energy drew another picture. This one showed Douglas, lying on the floor, a dark cloud hovering over him. She pointed to the cloud, then to herself, then drew herself standing protectively over his prone figure. She tapped the drawing insistently. She was coming with him to protect him. Douglas stared at the drawing, at the raw emotion etched into the metal. He saw not just a child, but a fiercely protective being, determined to safeguard him. He sighed, the air escaping his lungs in a rush. He knew he should refuse, that it was too dangerous. But he also knew that Lita's unique perspective, her connection to the natural world, might be their only chance. And if he was honest with himself, he didn't want to leave her behind. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he rasped, his voice hoarse. He pointed to himself, then to Lita, then drew a circle around them both. Together. He rummaged through the storage containers, pulling out emergency blankets and spare plating. He fashioned crude protective suits, layering the blankets with the metal, hoping it would offer some shielding from the radiation. It was a pathetic attempt, but it was all they had. The corridors were dimly lit and eerily silent, the only sound their own ragged breathing and the incessant clicking of the Geiger counter. The air tasted metallic, a gritty film coating their tongues. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a potential threat. Douglas led the way, his pulse pounding in his ears, his senses on high alert. They reached the Botany Lab. The door hung open, twisted metal framing a scene of devastation. Shelves had collapsed, scattering broken glass and desiccated plant matter across the floor. Most of the samples were withered husks, their potential long since extinguished. But then Lita gasped, pointing to a far corner of the lab. There, nestled amongst the debris, was a single seedling. It was small, fragile-looking, but its leaves glowed with a faint, ethereal light. Lita rushed to it, her eyes wide with wonder. She gently touched one of the leaves, then turned to Douglas, her face alight with excitement. She drew a picture in the dust, a symbol he didn't recognize. Ithorian, she managed to convey, pointing to herself, then to the seedling. It was a species native to her homeworld, known for its ability to absorb radiation. Hope surged through Douglas, a powerful, almost overwhelming sensation. He carefully dug up the seedling, cradling it in his hands. As they turned to leave, a section of the ceiling groaned ominously. Before Douglas could react, it collapsed, a shower of dust and debris blocking their original path. Coughing, Douglas shielded Lita with his body. When the dust settled, their way back was impassable. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. He scanned the room, desperately searching for an alternate route. Then, Lita tugged at his sleeve, pointing to a storage shelf tucked away in a dark corner. Behind it, barely visible, was a narrow opening. Douglas cautiously approached, pulling the shelf aside. It was a maintenance tunnel, its entrance concealed from view. He shone his light into the darkness, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic passage. He hesitated. It was an unknown path, potentially filled with dangers, but they had no other choice. He squeezed through the opening, Lita closed behind. The tunnel was cramped and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. As they moved deeper, Douglas noticed something strange. Deactivated surveillance cameras mounted on the walls, their lenses clouded with dust. And then he saw a discarded datapad lying on the floor near a junction box. It was ZZ Glorg technology. Douglas picked up the datapad, his mind racing. What were ZZ Glorg doing monitoring this outpost? What secrets did this datapad hold? He knew it could be a treasure trove of information, a potential game changer in the war. But it could also be a trap, a way for the enemy to track their movements. He looked at Lita, her eyes wide with concern. He knew they had to get back to the bunker to plant the seedling and try to contain the radiation leak. But the datapad, it was too important to ignore. They carefully made their way back through the tunnel, emerging into the ruined botany lab. They navigated the radiation-filled corridors, returning to the bunker, the seedling clutched tightly in Douglas's hand, the ZZ Glorg datapad tucked securely in his makeshift protective suit. The Geiger counter continued its relentless clicking, a constant reminder of the invisible threat that surrounded them. Back in the bunker, the radiation levels were still rising, albeit slowly. Time was running out. Lita pointed to the crack in the ventilation system, the source of the leak. Douglas nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He carefully dug a small hole near the crack and gently placed the Ithorian seedling into the earth. Lita placed her hands on either side of the plant, closing her eyes. A soft, humming sound emanated from her, a melodic vibration that filled the small space. The seedling began to glow brighter, its leaves pulsing with a soft, green light. The air around it shimmered, as if the radiation itself was being drawn into the plant. The seedling pulsed with a faint, internal light, its leaves shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. The radiation alarm still blared, but the frantic climb of the Geiger counter needle had slowed, stuttering like a wounded animal. It wasn't stopping it, not truly, but the little Ithorian plant was buying them time. Douglas knelt, his fingers clumsy as he worked the release on the ZZ Glorg datapad. The device felt alien in his hands, cold and angular. He brought up the display, a cascade of glyphs that resembled nothing in the human linguistic database. It was encrypted, heavily. Military-grade ZZ Glorg. Impenetrable. He swore under his breath, the futility of it all pressing down on him. Every potential solution seemed designed to lead to another dead end. Lita tugged at his sleeve, her large eyes fixed on the datapad. She made a soft, warbling sound, then reached out a tentative hand. Before Douglas could react, she began tracing patterns in the dust on the floor with her finger, a series of circles and lines connected by short, precise strokes. They looked like constellations. "You recognize it?" Douglas asked, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. He pointed to one of the glyphs on the screen, then to one of her drawings. She nodded, a small, hopeful expression on her face. He hesitated, then typed the sequence of symbols corresponding to Lita's constellation map into the datapad's decryption field. Nothing. He tried again, double-checking each symbol against her drawings. Still nothing. He was about to give up when he noticed Lita pointing insistently at a slightly different arrangement of stars. Taking a deep breath, Douglas re-entered the code, his fingers flying across the alien interface. The datapad beeped, a short, tinny sound. A lower-level directory sprang open. By God, Douglas breathed, staring at the screen. The directory contained schematics, blueprints of the outpost, but not the ones he knew. These were different, incomplete showing sections that didn't exist on any human-issued plans. He zoomed in, his heart pounding. One section in particular caught his eye. It was marked in faded ZZ Glorg script, a hidden chamber buried deep beneath the outpost. "Where is it?" he muttered, scrolling through the schematic. "Where the hell is it?" Lita pointed to a location on the screen, her finger resting on a spot directly beneath the botany lab. His blood ran cold. The botany lab, the source of the radiation leak. The radiation alarm's pitch suddenly intensified, screeching in his ears. The air shimmered with heat. Time was up. "We have to move," he said, grabbing Lita's hand. "Now." He led her back through the bunker, the urgency driving him forward. They reached the maintenance tunnel, the narrow passage leading away from the contaminated area. Without hesitation, he plunged into the darkness, Lita closed behind. The tunnel was cramped and claustrophobic, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something acrid and alien. As they moved deeper, Douglas noticed discarded ration packs, ZZ Glorg rations, judging by the insectoid markings. There were crude tools scattered on the floor and patches of a strange, viscous residue clinging to the walls. It looked almost organic. Lita stopped suddenly, sniffing the air. She made a series of rapid clicks and whistles, then pointed to the residue on the wall. "What is it?" Douglas asked, knowing she couldn't understand him. She touched the residue, then drew a symbol in the air, a series of interlocking circles. A pheromone marker. ZZ Glorg. Territorial. This wasn't just a disused maintenance tunnel. This was, or had been, a ZZ Glorg habitation. They reached a fork in the tunnel, two paths diverging into the darkness. One led deeper underground, disappearing into the unknown depths. The other, according to the schematics, led towards the hidden section beneath the botany lab. Douglas hesitated for only a moment. The radiation was getting worse. They needed a solution, and fast. "This way," he said, choosing the path to the hidden section. The tunnel narrowed, the walls closing in around them. The air grew heavier, the smell more pungent. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, littered with loose rocks and debris. The tunnel felt unstable, like a giant lung about to collapse. Dust rained down from the ceiling with every step. He could hear Lita struggling to keep up, her breathing ragged. "Easy," he said, slowing his pace. "Careful where you step." They pressed on, their progress slow and painstaking. The tunnel groaned and shifted around them, threatening to bury them alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel. The passage opened into a small, circular chamber. The hidden section. The chamber was dimly lit by a flickering emergency light, revealing a scene of chaotic disarray. Wires hung from the ceiling, sparking intermittently. Consoles lay scattered on the floor, their screens shattered. In the center of the room stood a large cylindrical structure, a ZZ Glorg communication array, partially dismantled. Attached to the array, almost as an afterthought, was a small, battered object. Douglas recognized it instantly, a human distress beacon. Old, damaged. Hope extinguished long ago. He rushed to the beacon, his fingers tracing its worn surface. It was dead. No power. He turned back to the ZZ Glorg array, his mind racing. It was far beyond his understanding, a complex web of alien technology. "There's got to be something," he muttered, his voice tight with desperation. "There's got to be a way." Lita approached the array, her eyes wide with curiosity. She reached out a hand and touched one of the crystalline nodes on its surface. Her eyes widened further. She made a soft, humming sound, then gestured for Douglas to bring the Ithorian seedling closer. He hesitated, then carefully lifted the seedling from his pack. As he brought it near the array, something extraordinary happened. The seedling began to glow brighter, its leaves pulsing with an almost blinding light. The crystalline nodes on the array resonated with the seedling, emitting a faint, high-pitched whine. A thin stream of energy flowed from the seedling to the array, like a lifeline in the darkness. It's working," Douglas stammered, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's creating a circuit." He realized what he had to do. By connecting the seedling to the array, they might be able to send a short-range distress signal. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. He began to work feverishly, his hands moving with a speed and precision he didn't know he possessed. He scavenged wires from the damaged consoles, carefully connecting the seedling to the array's energy matrix. As he worked, a faint clicking sound echoed through the chamber. He ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. The clicking grew louder, closer. It was coming from the walls. Suddenly, cracks appeared in the chamber walls, spiderwebbing across the surface, and from those cracks something emerged. A swarm of small, insectoid creatures poured into the chamber, their metallic bodies glinting in the dim light. They were biomechanical in nature, with segmented limbs, razor-sharp mandibles, and glowing green eyes. They moved with terrifying speed and purpose, their clicking mandibles creating a cacophony of sound. They were drawn to the seedling, to the energy it was emitting. And they were hostile. The insectoids surged forward, their glowing eyes fixed on Douglas and Lita. Swarmed them. Biomechanical insectoids, a chitinous tide, poured from the shadows. Clicking mandibles snapped, filling the air with a dry, rasping sound. The metallic tang of ozone stung Douglas's nostrils as he shoved Lita behind the skeletal remains of the communication array. The ground vibrated beneath his worn boots, a tremor of approaching death. He raised his rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort, and squeezed off a burst. The rounds pinged harmlessly against the insectoid's metallic exoskeletons, ricocheting into the gloom. They were too heavily armored. Standard-issue kinetic rounds were useless. From behind him, a soft, wavering sound. Lita. She was humming, a series of Ithorian melodies that resonated deep within Douglas's chest, a strange counterpoint to the chaotic clicks and hisses of the approaching swarm. The seedling pulsed faintly in her lap, a soft, emerald glow. Then, a wave of energy. It radiated outwards from the seedling, invisible but palpable. The insectoids closest to them staggered, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Some toppled, their metallic limbs scraping against the metal floor. A momentary reprieve. Douglas's eyes widened. He saw it then, a shimmering distortion in the air around Lita and the seedling, a nascent shield of energy. "Lita," he said, his voice rough with urgency, "can you do that again? Focus. Keep them away." Understanding flickered in her large, amber eyes. She closed them, her humming growing stronger, more focused. The emerald glow intensified, pushing back the encroaching darkness. "Good," Douglas grunted, already stripping wires from the dismantled array. "Keep it up. I need time." He scavenged frantically, his fingers flying over the ruined components. Wires, conduits, power cells, anything he could use. The air crackled with the smell of burnt metal and desperation. He needed to connect the seedling to the array, to amplify its power, to send a distress signal. But the seedling's energy was organic, wild. He had to adapt it, to tame it, to force it into the rigid matrix of human technology. One wrong move, one surge of uncontrolled energy, and the whole system would overload, vaporizing them both. Lita's humming faltered. Her face, usually so vibrant, was pale and drawn. Sweat beaded on her brow. The insectoids, recovering from the initial pulse, pressed forward, their clicking mandibles a relentless drumbeat of doom. "Lita, hold on," Douglas urged, his voice tight with anxiety. "Just a little longer." He spliced a frayed wire, sparks showering from the connection. He rerouted a power cell, bypassing a damaged regulator. The seedling thrummed in response, its light flickering erratically. Then, a stable connection. A faint hum resonated through the chamber, a fragile song of hope amidst the symphony of destruction. The chamber lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. The ZZ-Glorg communication array, dormant for decades, began to power up. Symbols and glyphs, alien and incomprehensible, scrolled across its surface. Douglas ignored them, his focus solely on the control panel. He punched in the human distress signal frequency, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He had to get a message out. He had to warn them. But instead of a distress signal, a holographic display flickered to life in the center of the chamber. A three-dimensional image coalesced, resolving into the sleek, predatory form of a ZZ-Glorg warship. It was rapidly approaching their location. His blood ran cold. He hadn't sent a distress signal. He'd sent a beacon. The array was still set to transmit on ZZ-Glorg military frequencies. They just signaled the ZZ-Glorg collective, announcing their presence to the enemy. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. He turned to Lita. She was slumped against the base of the seedling, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. The emerald glow had faded, replaced by the pallor of exhaustion. She had given everything to defend them, and it hadn't been enough. Her skin felt clammy beneath his fingers. Useless. He pressed harder, willing her back, the distant thrum against his eardrums growing louder, closer. The seedling, clutched in her small hand, pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, mirroring the frantic beat of his own heart. Then a new sound, unmistakable, the screech of a ZZ Glorg warship tearing through the atmosphere. The ground vibrated, a low, guttural hum that resonated in his bones. They were here. Staying meant certain death. Douglas scanned the surroundings, his mind racing. The jungle. It was their only chance. He scooped Lita into his arms, her small body limp and unresponsive. Each step was a battle against the dense undergrowth, vines snagging at his boots, branches whipping his face. He pushed through, driven by a primal need to protect. As he stumbled forward, he noticed it, a faint, ethereal glow emanating from Lita's skin, patterns of light that pulsed in rhythm with the seedling in her hand. The light was alien, beautiful, and terrifying. The warship's shadow fell across the jungle canopy as it landed with earth-shattering force near the outpost. He heard the hiss of pressurized doors and the guttural commands of the ZZ Glorg. Scouting parties would be deployed, systematically combing the area. He needed cover fast. Ahead, a break in the foliage, the dark maw of a cave system nestled amongst the roots of a giant, ancient tree. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. He ducked inside, the air immediately cooler, damper. The smell of earth and decay filled his nostrils. He gently laid Lita down on the cave floor, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the entrance. He tore away handfuls of foliage, carefully concealing the opening, praying it would be enough. He couldn't leave her defenseless. Grimly, he turned back toward the outpost. He had to get supplies, weapons, food, a medical kit. It was a suicide mission, but he couldn't abandon her. The outpost was eerily silent, the only sound the distant drone of the warship. He moved like a ghost, retrieving his rifle, a handful of nutrient bars, and the battered medical kit. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Back in the jungle, the air was thick with tension. He could hear the distinct sounds of the ZZ Glorg scouting parties, the snap of branches, the guttural clicks of their communication devices. They were close. At the outpost, the ZZ Glorg leader, a hulking figure with chitinous armor, examined the communication array. His multifaceted eyes narrowed as he noted the human modifications, the jury-rigged repairs, the desperate attempts to boost the signal. Human tech, he rasped, his voice a grating buzz. Inefficient but persistent. He gestured to his soldiers. Search the area. Human and Ithorian presence detected. Eliminate all threats. One scout, separated from his patrol, pushed deeper into the jungle. The air hung heavy, thick with the cloying scent of exotic flora. He paused, his antennae twitching, detecting a faint, unfamiliar scent, a subtle pheromonal signature. It was Ithorian. Cautiously, he approached the hidden cave, his weapon raised. The scent grew stronger, emanating from the darkness within. He activated his bioluminescent headlamp, illuminating the cave entrance. Inside, he saw her, the Ithorian youngling, lying still, her skin glowing with an unnatural light. He lowered his weapon slightly, a flicker of something akin to curiosity in his multifaceted eyes. She looked so small, so vulnerable. He took a step closer, his chitinous feet scraping against the cave floor. Ithorian. He croaked in broken Ithorian, a language he had learned for strategic purposes. Are you injured? No response. From the shadows at the back of the cave, Douglas watched, his heart pounding in his chest. The scout's hesitation was unexpected, unsettling. He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. He wouldn't hesitate. He couldn't. Just as he was about to fire, Lita stirred. Her eyes snapped open, glowing with a bright, unfamiliar light. And then she spoke. Not in Ithorian, not in broken common, but in perfect, guttural ZZ Glorg. Do not harm him, she said, her voice echoing with an alien authority. Douglas hesitated, his fist clenched as he gripped his rifle. The weapon dipped almost imperceptibly, the movement betraying his confusion. Lita was speaking, but not in the Ithorian chirps and whistles he'd slowly begun to decipher. This was guttural, sharp, the harsh, clicking language of the ZZ-Glorg. Lita, still trembling, her large eyes darting between Douglas and the armored figure, spoke rapidly in ZZ-Glorg. "He is holding me prisoner. I need your help to escape." Her voice, though alien, was tinged with desperation. The ZZ-Glorg scout, his multifaceted eyes narrowing behind his helmet, deactivated the energy blade humming at his wrist. The weapon retracted with a soft hiss. He responded to Lita, his mandibles clicking in a series of complex sounds. "How do you know our tongue, young one?" Lita's voice trembled as she continued in ZZ-Glorg. I was taken to a ZZ-Glorg research facility after the attack on my village. They forced me to study your language, your culture." The words seemed to catch in her throat, a bitter taste on her non-existent tongue. Douglas, his brow furrowed, his grip tightening on his rifle once more, snapped, "What the hell is going on? What are you saying to him?" The English words echoed in the confined space, imbued with a suspicion that threatened to choke him. He felt the sting of betrayal, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The ZZ-Glorg scout shifted his gaze to Douglas. He spoke, his voice a raspy buzz filtered through his vocoder. "I am Krell," she says. "She was prisoner, forced to learn our speak." His English was fractured, halting, but the meaning was clear. Krell paused, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the dim light of the cave. I am tired of this war. I search for a way to stop the fighting." The words hung in the air, heavy with treason. Douglas scoffed, his voice permeated with disbelief. "Oh, really? And I'm supposed to believe that? We're about to have a whole damn warship land on our heads and you're telling me you want peace?" He gestured towards the cave entrance, the sound of approaching engines growing louder. "We're all going to be dead in 5 minutes." Krell tilted his head, his insectoid features unreadable. Her knowledge of ZZ-Glorg customs, language, it may be our only chance. He turned back to Lita, a flicker of something akin to hope in his many eyes. Lita, her voice small but firm, spoke in English. I know of a secret communication channel used by high-ranking officers only." Douglas stared at her, his mind racing. A secret communication channel. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only option that didn't involve certain death. He weighed the risks, the odds stacked against them like fallen dominoes. Krell took a step forward, his armored hand outstretched. "I can help you. I can help you infiltrate the warship. We can send a message." Douglas's eyes narrowed. He didn't trust this Krell, not one bit. But Lita. He looked at her pleading face, her wide, trusting eyes. He saw the flicker of hope reflected in their depths, a hope he desperately wanted to believe in. The roar of the approaching warship intensified, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The jungle outside was alive with the sounds of ZZ-Glorg soldiers, their clicking mandibles and guttural commands growing closer. Douglas took a deep breath, the musty air filling his lungs. He made his decision. "All right," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But I'm watching you, Krell. One wrong move, one sign of betrayal, and I'll put a plasma bolt through your skull." Krell nodded, his expression grim. "I understand." He turned and gestured towards the back of the cave. "There is a passage. It connects to the jungle floor closer to the landing site. It is hidden." Krell led the way, his armored form moving with surprising agility through the narrow passage. Douglas followed, his rifle raised, Lita close behind him. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. They emerged from the hidden passage near the edge of the jungle. The ZZ-Glorg warship, a hulking mass of dark metal and overflowing weaponry, dominated the landscape. Heavily armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their energy weapons glinting in the dappled sunlight. Krell pointed to a specific section of the warship's hull. "There, a maintenance hatch, rarely used. It may be our INY way in," and pressed forward. Using Krell's shaky directions, they crept along the cold, metallic hull, the dim emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows that danced with every subtle movement. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of coolant and the distant, guttural hum of the warship's engines. Douglas kept his hand near his sidearm, his senses on high alert. He didn't trust Krell, not entirely. The alien's eagerness to help felt off, too convenient. Krell stopped before a recess panel, his multi-jointed fingers dancing across the interface. This is it. Maintenance Hatch 7 Gamma. Stand back. He entered a series of commands, the panel flashing a sequence of crimson glyphs before a section of the wall hissed open, revealing a cramped and dimly lit service corridor. The air within was thick and acrid, stinging Douglas's nostrils. A malfunctioning ventilation system spewed forth a cloud of noxious gas, a swirling green mist that obscured the already limited visibility. He coughed, his eyes watering. Lita whimpered, pressing closer to him. "Damn it," Krell hissed, waving a hand in front of his face. This wasn't supposed to be active. Douglas, his mind already racing, pulled a discarded maintenance rag from his belt and ripped it in two. He quickly wet them with his canteen, fashioning makeshift filters. "Here," he said, handing one to Lita and securing the other over his own mouth and nose. "Hold it tight." He took another rag and began stuffing it into a crack in the ventilation duct, slowing the flow of the gas. The air still burned, but it was now manageable. Krell stared at him, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his multifaceted eyes. "Impressive, human, you think quickly." Douglas grunted, his gaze unwavering. "We move now." They pressed on, Lita leading the way through the labyrinthine corridors. The ship's interior was a claustrophobic maze of pipes, conduits, and access panels, all rendered in a utilitarian gray that seemed to amplify the oppressive atmosphere. Lita, despite her fear, navigated the twists and turns with surprising confidence, her small hand occasionally brushing against the cold metal walls. "This way," she sang softly, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow passage like wind through a cavern. "The communication center. It is not far." Douglas frowned, the sound setting his teeth on edge. He still couldn't understand the intent, but he trusted her knowledge for now. They reached a security checkpoint, a reinforced doorway guarded by two heavily armed Glorg soldiers. The soldiers stood rigidly at attention, their chitinous armor gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Krell stepped forward, his voice taking on a tone of authority. "I am Krell of the 7th Battalion. I have urgent business with the communication officer. Open this door." The soldiers remained impassive, their multifaceted eyes scrutinizing Krell. "Identification and clearance code required, Officer Krell," one of them rasped, his voice a dry, clicking sound. Krell hesitated, his mandibles clicking nervously. I seem to have misplaced my access card, but I assure you this is a matter of utmost importance." The soldier remained unmoved. "Higher-level clearance code is required to bypass security protocols." Lita tugged at Douglas's sleeve, her eyes wide with apprehension. She whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ship's engines, "There is another way. A back entrance, but it is dangerous, a maintenance shaft." Douglas's gaze flicked between Krell and the unyielding guards. Krell's stalling tactics felt rehearsed, too convenient. His distrust flared. "What's going on, Krell?" Krell spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "I assure you nothing. These soldiers are simply thorough." Douglas ignored him, turning to Lita. "How dangerous?" She shivered, her voice barely a whisper. "Many things, exposed wires, power surges, guards." Douglas made his decision. He trusted Lita more than Krell. "We take the back entrance." Krell's mandibles clicked in protest. "That is unwise, human. The maintenance shafts are unstable, unpredictable." Douglas silenced him with a glare. "Lead the way, Lita." Lita led them to a narrow access panel concealed behind a tangle of cables. She pried it open, revealing a dark and cramped maintenance shaft. The air within was thick with dust and the smell of ozone. Exposed wires snaked across the walls, sparking intermittently. They squeezed into the shaft, crawling on their hands and knees through the narrow space. The metal walls were cold and damp against their skin. Douglas felt a surge of claustrophobia, the confined space pressing in on him. Suddenly, a surge of power coursed through the shaft, sending sparks flying from the exposed wires. An alarm blared, its shrill sound echoing through the ship. Red lights flashed, bathing the shaft in an ominous glow. "They know we're here," Krell shouted, his voice filled with panic. "I can create a diversion. Give me a moment." Douglas hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay and fight, but Lita tugged at his arm, her eyes pleading. "We must go, the communication center." He looked from Lita to Krell, his face etched with indecision. He didn't want to leave Krell behind, but Lita's safety was paramount. "Go," Krell yelled, scrambling back towards the access panel. "I'll draw them away, trust me." Douglas made his decision. "Go, Lita, now." With a final glance at Krell, he followed Lita deeper into the maintenance shaft. A moment later, a deafening explosion rocked the ship, shaking the shaft violently. The alarm intensified, and the sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance. Douglas and Lita pressed on, crawling through the narrow space, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached the end of the shaft, emerging into a small, dimly lit alcove behind the communication center. The alcove was guarded by a single ZZ Glorg officer, his weapon drawn. The officer's multifaceted eyes widened in recognition as he saw Lita. "Traitor!" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You will pay for your betrayal." He raised his weapon, aiming directly at Lita. Douglas lunged forward, tackling the officer to the ground. The officer was strong, battle-hardened, but Douglas was fueled by adrenaline and a fierce protectiveness. They grappled on the cold metal floor, exchanging blows. The officer managed to land a blow to Douglas's ribs, sending a searing pain through his chest. Douglas ignored it, focusing on disarming the officer. He managed to knock the weapon from the officer's grasp, but the officer retaliated with a vicious headbutt, sending stars exploding behind Douglas's eyes. Despite the pain, Douglas pressed his advantage, using his weight and training to subdue the officer. He pinned him to the ground, his forearm pressing against the officer's throat. He could feel the officer's struggles weakening. He could end it here, snap the alien's neck and be done with it, but he didn't. He tightened his grip just enough to render the officer unconscious. He staggered to his feet, clutching his ribs, a searing pain radiating through his chest. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. He looked down at Lita, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you all right?" he rasped, his voice strained. She nodded, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Douglas." He managed a weak smile. "We're not done yet." They entered the communication center. Rows of consoles blinked with alien symbols. The air hummed with energy. But the main console, the one they needed to access, was locked down, a complex series of biometric scanners guarding its secrets. A message scrolled across the screen in ZZ Glorg script, "Biometric override required." Lita's brow furrowed. Wait, there was a less secure maintenance override for the communication console, I remember, at the facility. Douglas leaned heavily against the console, his breath ragged. "Where?" "Nearby, through a service panel, but..." He pushed himself upright, a sharp intake of breath betraying the pain he was trying to mask. He moved, though slower now, toward the direction Lita indicated, and immediately his knee buckled. He fell to the ground. Lita rushed to his side, her small hands fluttering over his leg. "Douglas, what's wrong?" He gritted his teeth. "Old wound, acting up." But the pallor of his skin and the way sweat beaded on his forehead told a different story. The wound Krell had tended to was infected. The air around it throbbed with heat. Lita's multifaceted eyes widened. She reached out to touch the wound, then withdrew her hand quickly. "Wait, I know something that might help." She scurried back to their meager supplies, rummaging through the salvaged medical kit. She returned with a vial of viscous, luminescent fluid. At the research facility, they taught us some Ithorian healing techniques. This will slow the infection, but it won't cure it. Douglas watched her skeptically as she applied the fluid to his wound. It stung like fire, but a moment later a strange coolness spread through his leg, dulling the throbbing pain. He looked at Lita, surprised. "Thanks." "The panel," she urged, gesturing down the corridor. "It's not far." They reached the service panel, a rectangular plate sealed with a magnetic lock. Lita ran her fingers over the surface, her expression falling. "It requires a physical keycard." "I don't know where to find one." Douglas closed his eyes, fighting the wave of dizziness threatening to overwhelm him. The ZZ Glorg officer, the one he'd subdued. The body, the officer, he had a keycard. Lita recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I can't." "Lita, listen to me. We don't have a choice, Krell. He sacrificed himself for us. This is the only way to make it mean something. I can barely stand. You have to do this." His voice was rough, pleading, "Please." Her lower mouth trembled, but she nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it." She disappeared down the corridor, her small footsteps echoing in the silence. Douglas leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He closed his eyes, picturing Krell's face, the moment of sacrifice. He felt a surge of guilt, using Lita like this, but he pushed it down. The galaxy was at stake. A few minutes later, Lita returned, her face pale but her hand clutching a small, metallic card. She didn't meet his eyes as she slotted the card into the panel. The lock clicked open. Inside, a tangle of wires and circuits hummed with power. Lita, with surprising dexterity, bypassed the security protocols, her fingers dancing over the controls. A series of clicks and whirs, and then a small screen flickered to life, displaying a simplified interface. "I've unlocked the maintenance override," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Limited access, but it's something." Suddenly, a red light flashed on the console. A klaxon blared, cutting through the silence. "They know we're here," Douglas said, his voice grim. "They're coming." He scanned the console, his eyes darting over the schematics. "Wait, I see something. A vulnerability in their communication network. A feedback loop. If we can manipulate it correctly, we can overload the whole system." "But how?" Lita asked, her voice filled with panic. "To exploit it, we need a higher security level, which means overriding another protocol." He pointed to a heavily shielded section of the console. "That's the data vault. Contains highly sensitive information about their military operations, their political secrets." Lita gasped. "But that's dangerous. What if we compromise innocent lives?" Douglas stared at the data vault, his face etched with conflict. He knew the risks. He knew the potential consequences. But he also knew the alternative, the endless war, the countless lives already lost. He closed his eyes, picturing the faces of the dead, the burning worlds, the endless cycle of violence. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and hard. "The lesser of two evils." He reached out and initiated the override sequence. The console hummed, the lights flickering erratically. A warning message flashed on the screen: "Unauthorized access detected. System integrity compromised." A heartbeat later, the message disappeared. Read, "They were in." But a new, silent alarm had been triggered directly to High Command. Douglas ignored it, his fingers flying over the console. He rerouted power, bypassed security protocols, and initiated the feedback loop. The communication system began to resonate, building in intensity. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The console went dark. The klaxon fell silent. The entire warship plunged into temporary darkness. "Did it work?" Lita asked, her voice trembling. "It bought us time," Douglas said, his voice grim. "But it also told them exactly where we are." As the emergency lights flickered back to life, a face appeared on a nearby monitor, a ZZ Glorg, but unlike any they had seen before. His chitinous armor was polished to a mirror sheen, His mandibles were sharp and cruel, and his eyes burned with cold intelligence. It was General Vrook, one of the most feared commanders in the ZZ-Glorg military. "Humans," Vrook hissed, his voice a rasping growl. "You have interfered for the last time. Your defiance ends here, and it will be painful." The monitor went dark. Douglas looked at Lita, his face grim. They were now directly targeted by one of the most dangerous figures in the galaxy. The blast doors slammed shut behind them, the echoing clang swallowed by the warship's groaning innards. Alarms blared, a dissonant symphony of red alerts that painted the narrow corridor in strobing light. Douglas, chest heaving, leaned against the cold durasteel, his hand instinctively checking the pulse rifle slung across his back. His left arm throbbed, the alien toxin a burning brand beneath his skin. Vrook's voice, amplified and distorted, boomed through the ship's comm system. "Lockdown protocols overridden. Priority 1, capture of fugitives. All units converge on sectors 4 through 7. Douglas cursed under his breath. He's pulled out all the stops. He pushed himself upright, the effort sending a wave of nausea through him. His vision swam for a moment, the corridor tilting at a sickening angle. The infection was worsening, feeding on his strength. He could feel it in his bones, a creeping cold that threatened to consume him. The walls seemed to breathe, the metallic surfaces rippling like water. He blinked hard, trying to focus on Lita, who was clinging to his leg, her large eyes wide with fear. "Stay close," he rasped, his voice thick. He needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere he could think. His mind felt like static, fragmented and unreliable. Suddenly, Lita tugged on his hand, pointing towards the wall. "Look," Douglas squinted, his vision still blurred. Etched onto the dull metal were a series of swirling patterns, crude but undeniably artistic. They pulsed with faint, bioluminescent light, illuminating the corridor in an eerie glow. Lita had used salvaged pigments and some kind of organic solvent to create the images. They depicted distorted figures, impossible landscapes, and unsettling geometric shapes. "A distraction," Douglas muttered, his head pounding. The images were strangely disorienting, playing tricks on his perception. He could only imagine what they were doing to the ZZ-Glorg soldiers, with their compound eyes and rigid sense of order. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, growing louder with each passing second. Boots echoed in the distance, the unmistakable sound of approaching soldiers. "This way," Douglas urged, pulling Lita along. He spotted a barely visible access panel tucked away in a shadowed alcove. He pried it open, revealing a narrow, cylindrical tunnel. "Maintenance access. It's our only chance." He squeezed into the tunnel, the confined space pressing in on him. Lita followed close behind, her small frame easily navigating the cramped passage. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and stale coolant. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinth of pipes and conduits. It was dark and claustrophobic, but it offered a temporary respite from the relentless pursuit. Deeper within the tunnel, nestled amongst the cables and wiring, they found it, a damaged ZZ-Glorg drone. Its metallic shell was dented and scarred, one of its optical sensors shattered. Wires spilled from its chassis like entrails. It was clearly beyond repair, discarded and forgotten. "Can you fix it?" Douglas asked, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed to the drone, hoping against hope. Lita examined the drone with surprising expertise, her fingers tracing the damaged circuits. She nodded slowly, a flicker of drive in her eyes. "I think so. I learned some things at the research facility." Douglas watched as Lita began to work, her nimble fingers manipulating the wires and components with practiced ease. He was amazed by her skill, her ability to coax life back into the broken machine. The Ithorian research facility, he remembered, was not just a place of study but also a place to experiment on younglings. What had she been forced to learn? Hours passed in the cramped tunnel, the only light coming from Lita's small work lamp. Douglas's fever spiked, his hallucinations intensifying. He saw phantoms in the shadows, heard whispers in the hiss of the ventilation system. He fought to stay focused to protect Lita, but the infection was slowly eroding his will. Finally, Lita straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow. "Done," she announced, her voice filled with quiet pride. The drone sputtered to life, its remaining optical sensor glowing with a faint, eerie light. It hovered in the air for a moment, then stabilized, its internal systems whirring softly. "Range is limited," Lita explained, "but it can see nearby corridors." Douglas activated the drone's visual feed, displaying a grainy image on his wrist-mounted communicator. The drone's camera panned across the adjacent corridor, revealing a group of Glorg soldiers patrolling the area. Then something else caught his eye, a small, heavily guarded bay containing a sleek black shuttle. Vrook's personal transport, Douglas realized. He zoomed in on the shuttle, his eyes narrowing. Suddenly, a burst of static interrupted the drone's feed. A coded message, garbled and fragmented, crackled through the comm system. Douglas recognized the encryption, a high-level Glorg military protocol. He worked feverishly, his fingers flying across the keypad, deciphering the message. The words swam before his eyes, distorted by his fever, but he managed to piece together the gist of it. Eliminate all traces. Communication system manipulation. Unacceptable risk. Douglas swore. "He's not just after us, he's trying to cover something up." "The message," Lita said, her voice soft but urgent. "It mentioned Thrax." "No," Douglas replied, shaking his head. "It's like Vrook is acting on his own against Thrax's orders. Maybe a personal vendetta." He reactivated the drone, focusing on Vrook's shuttle. "We need to buy ourselves some time." He formulated a plan, his mind racing. "Lita, I need you to do something dangerous." He explained his plan, his voice low and urgent. Lita listened intently, her expression unreadable. "I can do it," she said finally, her voice firm. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet grit. Douglas was taken aback by her bravery. "Are you sure? It's risky." "I want to help," she replied simply. Douglas showed her how to construct a makeshift explosive device using salvaged components from the drone. It was crude, but it would be enough to disable the shuttle, at least temporarily. While Lita carefully prepared the device, Douglas continued to monitor the comm system, hoping to intercept more information. He caught another fragment of coded communication, this one even more disturbing. "Alliance with the Krill. Promise of resources. Thrax must not know." The Krill, a ruthless, expansionist species known for their brutality and their insatiable hunger for conquest. If Vrook was in league with them, it could mean disaster for both the humans and the Ithorians. Lita finished assembling the explosive. It was a small, unassuming package, but it contained enough power to cripple the shuttle's engines. "Ready," she said, handing the device to Douglas. He armed the explosive and gave it back to her. "Be careful," he said, his voice tight with worry. Lita nodded and slipped out of the tunnel, disappearing into the shadows. Douglas held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched the drone feed, his eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of danger. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then finally he saw her, a small figure darting across the corridor, heading towards the shuttle. She moved quickly and silently, her movements fluid and graceful. She reached the shuttle and disappeared beneath it, her small hands working quickly and efficiently. A moment later, she reappeared, sprinting back towards the tunnel. "Now!" Douglas yelled, triggering the detonator. A muffled explosion rocked the warship, sending tremors through the tunnel. The drone feed flickered and died. Vrook's voice, filled with rage, echoed through the comm system. "They sabotaged my shuttle. Find them. I want them alive." Douglas pulled Lita back into the tunnel, sealing the access panel behind them. "We need to move," he said, his voice urgent. Suddenly, a new voice crackled through the comm system, a voice they hadn't heard before. It was a Glorg voice, but it sounded different, softer, more melodic. "Fugitives, this is Pilot Eleni. I am a supporter of peace. I can help you." Douglas frowned, his hand instinctively reaching for his pulse rifle. A trap, who is this? I know of a hidden escape pod, Eleni continued, his voice calm and reassuring, and a route to a neutral trading station. I can guide you. Douglas hesitated. It sounded too good to be true. He didn't trust it. Douglas, please, Lita urged, tugging on his sleeve. He looked down at her, her large eyes pleading. I think he is telling the truth. I can feel it. Douglas stared at her, his mind racing. Could he trust her instincts? Could he trust this unknown pilot? He was running out of options. And what guarantees do we have that this isn't a trap? Douglas asked, his gaze unwavering, locked onto the multifaceted eyes of the ZZ-Glorg pilot. He called himself Xyler. The pilot's mandibles clicked softly, a gesture that Douglas interpreted as nervous agreement. Conditions, human, you have them, but speed is paramount. Vrook will not remain unaware for long. Douglas nodded, his mind already racing. First, Lita stays with me. Second, I want a full schematic of the escape pod, including its signal frequencies. Third, you lead the way, but understand this. Any deviation from our agreed-upon route, any hint of betrayal, and I'll make sure Vrook finds out exactly who helped us escape. Xyler inclined his head, a gesture that seemed surprisingly human. Agreed. Follow me. Xyler led them through a maze of corridors, the metallic tang of ZZ-Glorg engineering filling the air. They reached a secluded bay, where a small, battered escape pod sat bathed in the dim red emergency lights. An older model, Xyler admitted, his voice tinged with regret. Limited range, minimal life support but functional. It was scheduled for decommissioning cycles ago. As Douglas helped Lita into the cramped pod, Xyler worked at the control panel, his nimble appendages dancing across the archaic interface. I am part of a disagreement. Within the collective, we believe Vrook's methods are unnecessary. That piece is possible. Douglas grunted, securing Lita in her harness. Peace. After a century of war, you're a dreamer, Xyler. He paused, considering. Vrook's unauthorized actions. Whisper mentioned secret alliances. What can you tell me? Xyler hesitated, his gaze darting nervously around the bay. Vrook believes Thrax is weak, that his inclinations towards negotiation are a danger to our expansion. He has gathered support from several war clans, promising them greater glory. Suddenly, a klaxon blared, bathing the bay in pulsing red light. Patrol ship inbound. Xyler hissed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. We must leave now. He shoved Douglas into the pilot's seat, initiating the launch sequence. The pod shuddered violently as it detached from the station, hurtling into the black void. Outside, a ZZ-Glorg patrol ship loomed, its energy weapons charging. They've detected us, Douglas yelled, wrestling with the unfamiliar controls. Xyler punched in a series of commands, his movements frantic. I know their protocols. I can guide us through their patrol patterns. For a time, he expertly navigated the pod through a debris field, using the wreckage as cover. Lita, her eyes wide with fear, pointed at the control panel. Signal. Wrong. An idea sparked in Douglas's mind. Lita, can you change it? Make it look like something else? Lita nodded, her small hands flying across a blank panel. She began to draw, using salvaged wires and components to manipulate the pod's signal signature. Slowly, painstakingly, she transformed it, mimicking the energy signature of a damaged supply vessel. The patrol ship slowed, its weapons powering down. A garbled voice crackled over the comms. Vessel identified as cargo transport. Reporting damage, stand down. Xyler released a shuddering breath. It worked, for now. Hours later, they approached a massive space station, a sprawling web of interconnected modules and docking bays. The neutral trading station, a den of commerce, intrigue, and illicit deals. Whisper is here, Xyler said, guiding the pod towards a designated docking port. A human, information broker, discreet, expensive, he knows things. About Vrook, about Thrax. The station was a sensory assault. The air thrummed with the cacophony of 100 alien languages. the smells of exotic spices and unidentifiable chemicals assaulting Douglas's nostrils. Beings of every shape and size jostled through the crowded corridors, their eyes glinting with greed and suspicion. Xyler led Douglas through the throng to a darkened alcove, where a figure shrouded in shadows waited. "Whisper," Xyler said, his voice low. "This is Douglas, he seeks information." Whisper stepped forward, revealing a gaunt human face etched with the lines of countless deals and betrayals. "An Earth artifact," Whisper rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "That's the price, something unique, something I can't find anywhere else." While Douglas haggled with Whisper, Lita wandered away, drawn by the sounds of children's laughter. She found a small group of orphaned alien younglings huddled in a corner, their faces gaunt and their eyes filled with despair. Hesitantly, Lita approached them, pulling out a small piece of salvaged metal. She began to draw, her nimble fingers creating an image of a blooming flower, its petals radiating with impossible colors. The children watched, mesmerized. One by one they began to smile, their faces lighting up with a flicker of hope. Back in the alcove, Douglas was nearing an agreement with Whisper. "Vrook is working with Commander Glar of the Crimson Talon Fleet. They aim to destabilize Thrax, force a full-scale assault on Earth space." Whisper paused, his eyes glinting. "Thrax, he seeks peace, but his own people, they will tear him apart for it." Suddenly the station shuddered violently. Alarms blared and the sounds of gunfire echoed through the corridors. "Vrook," Xyler hissed, his mandibles clicking in panic. "He's found us." Whisper vanished into the shadows, leaving Douglas and Xyler to face the chaos alone. They used a tracker, Douglas realized, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. On the escape pod, Xyler's voice was barely a whisper. "My family, Vrook promised them safety if I told him where you were." Douglas stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "You betrayed us." Xyler's body trembled. "I had no choice, but I can still help you escape. Follow me." He led Douglas and Lita through a hidden passage, a secret route known only to a few. But as they reached the exit, a squad of Glorg soldiers appeared, blocking their way. "Go," Xyler shouted, shoving Douglas and Lita forward. "I'll hold them off." Douglas hesitated, but Xyler's desperate plea forced him to act. He grabbed Lita's hand and ran, the sounds of gunfire echoing behind them. They were separated in the chaos, a surge of panicked refugees sweeping Lita away. Douglas stumbled, falling to the ground, his head slamming against the durasteel floor. When he regained his senses, Lita was gone. His comm crackled to life. It was Vrook. "Looking for someone, human. I have your little friend. Come and get her, if you dare." Douglas, alone and injured, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage, clenched his fist. It wasn't just about ending the war anymore. It was about Lita, and his feelings were now far deeper than mere protectiveness. Deep within the bowels of the station, Lita was thrown into a cold, dark cell. Vrook loomed over her, his insected face contorted in a sneer. "Where is he, little one? What are his plans?" Lita stared at him, her eyes filled with defiance. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached for a piece of discarded metal and began to draw on the cell wall. A simple image, but filled with a powerful emotion. A flower, its petals radiating with impossible colors, blooming in the darkness. Douglas, using his knowledge of the station's underbelly and his years of combat experience, began to formulate a plan. He was one man against an army, but he had something they didn't, a reason to fight, and he would tear this station apart to get her back. The world swam back into focus, a haze of smoke and grit stinging Douglas's eyes. His ribs screamed a protest with every shallow breath, and the metallic tang of blood filled his mouth. He spat, a crimson fleck landing on the grimy floor of what was once a bustling marketplace stall. Now, it was just wreckage. He'd taken the brunt of the blast behind a flimsy durasteel counter, and it had likely saved his life. Adrenaline surged, overriding the pain. Lita, he had to find her. Ignoring the throbbing in his head, Douglas scrambled to his feet, his movements jerky and uneven. He scavenged, his hands moving quickly, efficiently. A discarded medkit cracked, but with a usable synth bandage. A half-empty energy cell enough to power his sidearm. A battered data pad potentially useful for navigating this labyrinthine trading station. He moved deeper into the lower levels, the air thick with the stench of decay and desperation. Here, the station's glittering facade crumbled, revealing the rot beneath. He heard voices, hushed and wary, coming from a darkened alcove. He leveled his weapon, approaching cautiously. "Who's there?" A ragged group emerged, blinking in the dim light. Humans, their faces etched with hardship, and a pair of Grell, their bulbous eyes wide with fear. They were the station's forgotten, the ones chewed up and spat out by the criminal syndicates that controlled this place. "Stay back." A human woman snarled, clutching a makeshift weapon fashioned from scrap metal. "We got nothing to give." "I'm not here to take anything," Douglas said, his voice raspy. "I'm looking for someone, a young Ithorian. They took her." The woman's eyes narrowed. "The ZZ Glorg, Vrook's got her. She's as good as gone. Not if I can help it." Douglas lowered his weapon, extending a hand, palm open. "I need your help. I know this station. I need to get her back. In return, I can help you. I can help you all get out from under these bastards' thumbs." A beat of silence hung in the air, thick with distrust. Then one of the Grell, its voice a series of clicks and whistles translated by a worn translator implant, spoke. "What do you offer?" "They take everything." "I offer a chance," Douglas said, his gaze unwavering. "A chance to fight back. A chance to be free. I help you get free, you help me get my friend back." In her makeshift cell, a cramped storage compartment repurposed with energy bars, Lita sat cross-legged on the floor, her head bowed. Vrook's interrogation had been brutal, not physically, but with its cold, calculating questions designed to break her spirit. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Using a piece of discarded metal she'd found, she began to draw on the wall. Not words, but images. Scenes of Ither, her home world before the war. Lush jungles, vibrant skies, her family singing in harmonic chorus. Then she drew a flower, its petals radiating with impossible colors, a symbol of hope amidst the darkness. A shadow fell across the doorway. A ZZ Glorg guard, his multifaceted eyes glinting in the dim light. He was young, his carapace not yet fully hardened, and there was a flicker of something in his gaze that wasn't malice. Lita held out her drawing, offering it to him. Vrook stormed back into the cell, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "Where are your allies? Who is helping you?" Lita remained silent, her eyes fixed on Vrook, a spark of defiance in their depths. Instead of answering, she picked up her makeshift stylus and began to draw again. This time, she drew the flower again, larger, bolder, its colors even more vibrant. She pushed it towards him. The sympathetic guard subtly diverted Vrook's attention, clearing his throat. "Commander, the prisoner requires sustenance, and the holding cell's climate controls are malfunctioning. I've filed the reports." Vrook snarled, but the distraction worked. "See to it, then, but do not let her out of your sight." He snatched the drawing of the flower. Douglas learned about the hidden network of tunnels from the Grell, a place where smugglers and black market traders plied their illicit wares. A dangerous route, riddled with traps and rival gangs, but it offered a chance to bypass the station's heavily guarded checkpoints. "We know the tunnels," the human woman said, her voice grudging. "We can get you through, but it'll cost you." "You already told me what it costs," Douglas replied. "Your freedom, and I intend to deliver." The group, a motley collection of humans and aliens, revealed their skills. A mechanic who could disable security systems, a medic who could patch up wounds, a slicer who could navigate the station's network. Douglas, with his combat experience and tactical acumen, would lead the way. They descended into the tunnels, the air growing thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The darkness pressed in, broken only by the flickering light of their makeshift torches. They moved cautiously, alert for danger. Vrook, pacing in his command center, his frustration mounting. He stared at the drawing of the flower, its simple beauty unsettling him. It spoke of a world without conflict, a world he couldn't comprehend. "Destroy them," he snarled, tossing the drawings to a subordinate. "All of them, and increase security around the prisoner. I want no more." Artistic expression. The crackdown was swift and brutal. Any artwork, any attempt to create beauty, was confiscated and destroyed. The station's oppressed population, already teetering on the edge of despair, felt the weight of Vrook's iron fist. The group rounded a corner and were met with a hail of blaster fire. A heavily armed patrol, guarding a stash of stolen goods. They were pinned down, the air filled with the whine of energy weapons and the screams of the wounded. Douglas barked orders, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "Mara, take the left flank. Grell, cover the rear. I'll draw their fire." He charged forward, firing his weapon, his movements fluid and deadly. He took down 2 of the guards before diving behind a pile of crates, narrowly avoiding a blast that vaporized the wall behind him. One of the humans, a young man named Kale, cried out, clutching his leg. A blaster bolt had hit him, severing an artery. Douglas crawled over to him, ignoring the renewed barrage of fire. "Medic, I need a medic." The medic rushed to Kale's side, but the wound was severe. "He's losing blood fast. We need to stop the bleeding." Douglas looked at Kale, his face pale and drawn. He looked at the tunnel ahead, the path to Lita. He had a choice to make. "Mara," he said, his voice tight, "you and the slicer go ahead, get to Lita. I'll stay here and help the medic." Mara protested, but Douglas cut her off. "That's an order, get going." He watched them disappear into the darkness, then turned his attention back to Kale, applying pressure to the wound, his hands stained with blood. Compassion and loyalty warred within him. The slicer reached him through the comms, a tense urgency in her voice. "Vrook is transporting Lita off the station immediately. He's taking her to a secure facility. And the ZZ-Glorg are ready to kill anyone that gets in their way." Vrook, satisfied with the crackdown, turned his attention to Douglas. He knew the human was somewhere in the tunnels, a persistent thorn in his side. "Set a trap," he ordered his lieutenant. "Lure him into the abandoned maintenance sector. He'll never see it coming." Douglas, tending to Kale, felt a prickle of unease. He knew he was running out of time. He needed to find Lita, and fast. He moved cautiously through the maintenance sector, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and decay. He could hear the hum of inactive machinery, the drip of water, the echo of his own footsteps. Then the lights flickered and died, plunging the sector into darkness. Blaster fire erupted from the shadows, cutting through the darkness like deadly ribbons. Douglas dove for cover, narrowly avoiding a fatal shot. He was surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. He was trapped. Lita, her mind racing, used the small piece of metal the sympathetic guard had provided to pick the lock on her cell. She was free. It was time to repay the guard. She ran through the corridors, her heart pounding. She could hear the sounds of fighting in the distance. She used her artistic skills to disrupt the electrical implants of the security guards. It was difficult, and she was working at the edge of her ability, but it worked. The security system was down. Douglas felt a surge of relief as the firing stopped. Then the lights came back on. Lita stood there, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes were shining with purpose. "Lita, Douglas, we must go." Before they could move, Vrook stepped out of the shadows, his face contorted with rage. He held the sympathetic ZZ-Glorg guard in front of him, a blaster pointed at his head. "End of the line, human." "Surrender, human," Vrook's voice boomed, the translator spitting out the words with harsh precision. He held the blaster pistol steady against the temple of the captured human guard, whose eyes darted nervously between Douglas and his captor. "Release your weapon and the youngling. In exchange, this one lives. Refuse and he dies. ZZ-Glorg efficiency demands swift choices." Douglas's grip tightened on his own weapon. The guard was a local, one of the many humans scraping by on this forsaken station. worthless in the grand scheme according to the ZZ Glorg, but not to Douglas. Lita, sensing the shift in tension, tugged at Douglas's sleeve, her dual mouths emitting a low, worried hum. An idea sparked, a desperate one. "All right, Vrook," Douglas said, his voice deceptively calm. "You win, but let the kid go first. She's got nothing to do with this." Vrook tilted his head, insectoid eyes gleaming with suspicion. A ruse, but acceptable, the youngling first. Douglas nodded to Lita. "Now, Lita, do it now." Before Vrook could react, Lita, with a speed that belied her small size, hurled a handful of shimmering dust into the air. It wasn't just dust. It was pigment she'd salvaged, mixed with some kind of luminescent fungus she'd found in the tunnels. As it caught the light, it swirled, forming a fleeting, illusory image of a massive, snarling predator lunging at Vrook. Vrook roared, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening Douglas needed. He lunged, knocking Vrook off balance. The blaster skittered across the metal floor. Douglas wrestled Vrook for his own weapon, managing to disarm the ZZ Glorg, sending the weapon flying. He had Vrook pinned, his hands around the ZZ Glorg's thick neck. He could end it here, end it now. But he hesitated. The cold-blooded efficiency of the ZZ Glorg. He couldn't bring himself to do it. A blaster shot rang out, not from Douglas. The guard, with a final surge of strength, had grabbed the discarded ZZ Glorg pistol and fired, hitting Vrook squarely in the chest. Vrook gurgled, his multifaceted eyes dimming. "Go!" The guard gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. "Get the girl out of here." "They'll be coming." He slumped lifeless against the wall. Douglas stared for a split second, shock warring with grief. He grabbed Lita's hand, pulling her away. "Run!" They sprinted down the narrow corridor, the sounds of heavy ZZ Glorg footsteps echoing behind them. "This way!" One of Douglas's allies shouted, waving them into a darkened tunnel. The chase was on. The tunnels twisted and turned, a labyrinth of shadows and echoing drips. Lita, despite her fear, was remarkably agile, navigating the uneven terrain with surprising ease. Douglas could hear the guttural roars of the pursuing ZZ Glorg, their heavy armor clanking against the metal walls. "Lita, can you do that illusion thing again?" Douglas yelled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lita nodded, her eyes wide with concentration. She reached into her pouch, pulling out another handful of dust. This time she created an image of a collapsed tunnel blocking the path ahead. The pursuing ZZ Glorg hesitated, momentarily confused. It bought them precious seconds, but it wouldn't last. Suddenly, a side passage opened, and another ZZ Glorg soldier emerged, cutting off their escape. One of Douglas's allies, a wiry human woman named Mara, shoved Douglas and Lita forward. "Keep going," she yelled. "I'll cover you." A volley of blaster fire erupted. Douglas heard Mara cry out. He glanced back, seeing her fall to the ground, surrounded by ZZ Glorg. They couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. "They want us alive," another ally, a grizzled old mechanic named Ben, said, his voice grim. "I heard Vrook give the order, capture not kill. They think we know something." Douglas's blood ran cold. It wasn't just about the stolen tech. It was about something bigger. "Vrook's not acting alone," Ben continued. "I overheard him talking to someone, a higher-ranking officer. Sounded important." The pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just some rogue operation. This was planned. They rounded a corner and stumbled into a small, hidden chamber. Ben pointed to a faded map etched onto the wall. "Found this a while back. Secret exit. Leads out of the station to the lower levels." A glimmer of hope, but their luck wouldn't hold. As they approached the exit, they were confronted by a group of heavily armed scavengers, their faces grim and hostile. "Hold it right there, off-worlders," their leader snarled, brandishing a rusty plasma rifle. "This is our territory. You want to pass, you pay the toll." "We don't have anything to pay," Douglas said, his hand hovering near his weapon. "But we need to get out of here. The ZZ Glorg are after us." The scavenger leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The ZZ Glorg, that's your problem, not ours. It will be your problem soon enough, Douglas countered. They're not just here for scrap, they're planning something bigger, something that will affect everyone on this station. He paused, letting his words sink in. Help us, and we might just be able to help you. Survive. The scavengers exchanged uneasy glances. Lita stepped forward, her eyes filled with a quiet persistence. She pulled out a small piece of metal and began to draw, her fingers moving with astonishing speed. In moments, she had created an image, a vibrant scene of the scavengers standing tall, free from oppression, the station bathed in sunlight. The scavengers stared at the drawing, their expressions softening. "All right," the leader said, his voice grudging. "We'll help you, but you owe us." They were almost there. Freedom was within reach. Then Vrook's voice echoed through the tunnel. "Nowhere left to run, human." Vrook emerged, blaster raised, his insectoid eyes burning with fury. "This station is not just a trading post. It is a staging ground, a forward operating base for the invasion of your pathetic little planet." Douglas felt a cold dread creep into his heart. It was worse than he imagined. Vrook fired. Douglas dove in front of Lita, taking the blast in his side. Pain exploded through his body. He stumbled, his vision blurring. The memories slammed into him. The burning fields, the screams, the faces of the dead, the war. It was all coming back. The reason he'd been stationed on this backwater moon in the first place. To be forgotten. Lita screamed, a high-pitched, keening sound that resonated through the tunnel, and then something extraordinary happened. A wave of energy pulsed from Lita, a raw, untamed force that crackled through the air. The lights flickered, then died. The hum of the ZZ-Glorg technology sputtered and ceased. Lita, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, had somehow overloaded the station's electrical grid. The tunnel shuddered. The ceiling groaned. "The station, it's collapsing," Ben yelled. Chunks of metal and debris began to fall from the ceiling. The scavengers scattered, fleeing for their lives. "Go, get out of here," Douglas shouted, pushing Ben and the others towards the exit. "Get to the escape pods, tell them what's happening." They hesitated, then obeyed, disappearing into the darkness. Douglas turned to Lita, shielding her with his body. "We need to go." But it was too late. A section of the tunnel collapsed, blocking their path. They were trapped. Debris rained down around them. Douglas wrapped his arms around Lita, protecting her from the falling metal. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end. Then a voice, raspy and ancient, cut through the chaos. "Looking for a way out, little ones? I can help you, but the price is steep." The figure stepped from the shadows, revealing a ZZ-Glorg unlike any Douglas had seen. This one was smaller, frailer, his chitinous armor dull and scarred. He held a device cobbled together from scavenged parts, its flickering screen casting an eerie green glow on his multifaceted eyes. "I am Xyler," he rasped, his translator struggling with the alien vocalizations. "Formerly of the Collective Science Division, now a dissenter." He gestured to the cramped space behind him, a makeshift lab crammed with wires, discarded tech, and half-dissected ZZ-Glorg equipment. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of coolant and the acrid scent of burning circuits. "I can offer you a way off this station, a route unknown to even Vrook." A smuggler's tunnel, long abandoned. Douglas narrowed his eyes, his hand instinctively drifting towards his sidearm. "What's the catch?" Xyler's mandibles clicked softly. "My price is information. I possess data, irrefutable evidence of the Collective's war crimes. I need your assistance in transmitting a message to their central network." Douglas hesitated, his expression resolutening. The weight of countless lost lives pressed down on him. That message, it could provoke them, bring down more fire on humanity. Lita tugged at his sleeve, her large, expressive eyes pleading. She held up a drawing, a vibrant depiction of a world teeming with life, untouched by war. The colors were almost painfully bright against the drab surroundings. In the center, two figures, one human, one Ithorian, stood hand in hand. Douglas stared at the drawing, his heart clenching. He saw not just Lita's hope, but the echo of a Fuduan. he had almost given up believing in. He met Zyler's gaze. "What kind of war crimes are we talking about?" Zyler activated the device, projecting a holographic display that flickered with schematics and data streams. "The collective is preparing a full-scale invasion. The target, the human colony on Cygnus VII, they plan to obliterate it." The image zoomed in on a planetary map, highlighting the colony's defenses, or rather the lack thereof. "It will be a slaughter." The air in the small space seemed to thicken. Douglas felt a cold dread creep into his bones. He had to act. "All right, Zyler. I'll help you send your message." Zyler nodded, a hint of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "The tunnels are not without their dangers, the collective. They experimented here. Failed projects, abandoned creatures, they still roam the shadows." As they descended into the tunnels, the air grew heavy and damp, thick with the stench of decay. The only light came from Douglas's rifle-mounted lamp, cutting through the oppressive darkness. The walls were slick with moisture, and the silence was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the occasional skittering sound. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed from the darkness ahead. 2 glowing eyes appeared, followed by a hulking shape that lunged from the shadows. It was a creature twisted by genetic manipulation, its limbs elongated and distorted, its face a grotesque parody of a Glorg warrior. Douglas reacted instantly, shoving Lita behind him and raising his rifle. He fired a burst of plasma, the bolts searing through the creature's flesh. It shrieked, a sound that scraped against the soul and collapsed in a twitching heap. "Remnants," Zyler said grimly, his voice barely a whisper. "Failed attempts to create the perfect soldier. They are unpredictable." They pressed on, Zyler using his knowledge of Glorg technology to bypass security grids and deactivated sentry drones. He moved with a surprising agility for his frail frame, his fingers dancing across control panels with practiced ease. Unbeknownst to Douglas, Zyler was also transmitting a coded message, not to the collective's central network but to Vrook. "I have located the human and the youngling," the message read. "They are heading towards the smuggler's exit. I will deliver them to you in exchange for safe passage off this station." As they rounded a corner, they were met by a hail of plasma fire. Vrook and a squad of Glorg warriors stood blocking their path. "The game is over, human," Vrook snarled, his mandibles clicking in triumph. "Zyler has shown us the way." Zyler's betrayal was clear. Vrook's warriors surged forward. Lita, without hesitation, grabbed a discarded energy cell and hurled it at a stack of unstable containers. The resulting explosion sent debris flying, creating a momentary distraction. "Go, Douglas," she cried, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Get out of here." Douglas hesitated, torn between protecting Lita and escaping, but he knew she was right. He had to get the information about the invasion to the colony. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, and darted into the darkness. Vrook's warriors swarmed over Lita, dragging her away. Alone now, Douglas found himself in a labyrinth of corridors. He stumbled upon a group of beings huddled in the shadows. They were gaunt and scarred, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. They were members of a nomadic species, once enslaved by the Glorg. They snarled, weapons raised. Douglas recognized their leader. He was the one Douglas had bartered with earlier. "I remember you," the leader growled, his voice rough. "You spoke with respect." "I need your help," Douglas said, his voice urgent. "The Glorg have captured a youngling. I need to rescue her." The leader considered him for a moment, then nodded. "We know this station. We know its secrets. We will help you, if you promise to help us escape this place." "Agreed," Douglas said without hesitation. Guided by the scavengers, Douglas navigated the hidden passages of the Glorg base. They slipped past patrols, disabled surveillance cameras, and avoided detection with a skill born of desperation. Finally, they reached the holding cells. Douglas found Lita strapped to a table, her face pale and streaked with grime. Vrook stood over her, hissing questions. "Where is Earth? Tell me the location of the human homeworld. Lita remained silent, her eyes defiant. Douglas burst into the room, firing his rifle. Vrook whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise. You. Douglas didn't waste time with words. He cut Lita free from the table and grabbed her hand. Let's go. They fought their way out of the base, the scavengers providing cover fire, but as they reached the exit they were cornered by Vrook and his remaining forces. The scavengers, their faces grim, stepped forward. Go, their leader shouted. We will hold them off. Without another word, they charged into the ZZ-Glorg ranks, a wave of fury and desperation. Douglas watched in horror as they fell, one by one, sacrificing themselves to buy him and Lita time. Tears streamed down Douglas's face as he pulled Lita towards a dark opening. He would not let their sacrifice be in vain. They reached the hidden escape route, a dilapidated freighter, its hull scarred and corroded but its engine still humming with a faint, desperate promise. He pulled Lita aboard. They were getting out of here. The docking clamps hissed open, releasing the freighter into the black void. Douglas gripped the controls, his fingers tightening. Alarms blared, a cacophony of klaxons echoing through the cramped cockpit. On the main view screen, a ZZ-Glorg patrol ship, insected and menacing, flashed past, its energy cannons glowing with malevolent intent. Too close, Douglas muttered, his voice tight. Way too close. He checked the diagnostics. Damn it, he swore, slamming a fist on the console. Hyperdrive's fried, severely. Looks like the station defenses did more damage than we thought. A holographic image flickered to life on the screen, Vrook's chitinous face contorted in fury. Brown, you will not escape. This insubordination will be met with swift and merciless retribution. The transmission cut, replaced by the insistent whine of pursuing fighters. Lita, her wide eyes reflecting the flashing red lights, touched Douglas's arm. Using her dual mouths, she hummed a series of complex tones, and suddenly the freighter's exterior shimmered, and the vessel morphed into a blurry yet passable image of a ZZ-Glorg transport. Good thinking, kid, Douglas said, a flicker of admiration in his voice. But it won't hold them for long. He accessed the freighter's schematics, his eyes scanning the complex diagrams. There's a chance, a slim one. If I can reroute power from the life support and scavenge some parts from the derelicts, we might be able to jury-rig something. Derelicts? Lita echoed, her voice infused with concern. Yeah, this sector's a graveyard, kid. Gotta play the hand we're dealt. The freighter lurched as Douglas steered it into a dense debris field, a chaotic jumble of shattered ships and asteroid fragments. Warning lights flashed as they narrowly avoided a collision with a massive chunk of twisted metal. Hold on tight, Douglas warned, his hands flying across the controls. Lita closed her eyes, focusing her Ithorian senses. After a moment, she pointed towards a particularly large fragment of a ZZ-Glorg cruiser, its hull riddled with gaping holes. There, deep inside, I sense usable parts. Douglas grimaced. That's a suicide run, kid. But he knew they had no choice. He guided the freighter towards the derelict cruiser, its decaying hull looming before them like a skeletal beast. They docked with a grinding clang, the airlock hissing open to reveal a dark, ominous corridor. Automated defenses might still be active, Douglas said, checking his pulse rifle. And who knows what else is lurking in here. As they moved deeper into the cruiser, motion sensors flickered to life, activating automated turrets that spat laser fire. Douglas returned fire. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. They pressed on, deeper into the darkness. A guttural growl echoed through the corridors. Suddenly, a mutated space creature, its body twisted and deformed by radiation, lunged at them. Douglas fired, the creature screeching as it fell. They reached the hyperdrive control room, finding the necessary components intact. Douglas worked feverishly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Almost there, he muttered, splicing wires and rerouting circuits. Suddenly, a piercing alarm blared through the cruiser. "Distress beacon," Douglas cursed. "We tripped it." Back on the freighter, Lita worked on a small canvas she had managed to salvage. Using luminescent algae and crushed minerals, she created a vivid drawing depicting the horrors of the war: burning cities, skeletal figures, weeping children. She transmitted the image on a low-frequency channel, hoping against hope that someone would see it. In one of the pursuing ZZ-Glorg fighters, a young pilot stared at his console. The image of Lita's drawing burned into his retinas. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. "What are you waiting for, Relic?" His wingman barked over the comms. "Destroy the freighter." Relic's internal monologue raged. "Is this what we fight for? To destroy children, to spread this pain?" He couldn't pull the trigger. Vrook, monitoring the squadron's progress, noticed Relic's hesitation. His chitinous mandibles clicked in anger. "Pilot Relic, explain your inaction." Silence. Vrook's eyes narrowed. He activated a remote override, a surge of energy coursing through Relic's fighter. The young pilot screamed as his body convulsed, his ship spiraling out of control before exploding in a fiery bloom. "Discipline will be maintained," Vrook hissed. Back on the freighter, Douglas finished the repairs. "All right, kid, this is it. I'm rerouting power from life support to give us a boost. It's risky, but it's our only shot." He threw the switch. The lights flickered, the temperature plummeted, and the engines roared to life. "Hold on." He initiated the hyperdrive jump. The freighter shuddered violently, alarms screaming as the ship was wrenched into hyperspace. Suddenly, the stars twisted and contorted, replaced by a swirling vortex of colors. A vision flashed before them. A ZZ-Glorg homeworld, ravaged by war, its once proud cities reduced to rubble. Mountains of corpses choked the horizon. The vision vanished as quickly as it appeared. The freighter was ejected from the anomaly, slamming onto the surface of a desolate, unknown planet. The ship groaned under the force of the impact, its hull breached, systems failing. Douglas coughed, struggling to regain consciousness. "Lita, you okay?" Lita groaned but nodded. Douglas looked out the viewport. A desolate landscape stretched before them, a barren wasteland under a crimson sky. "Where are we?" Lita asked, her voice trembling. Douglas shook his head, his face grim. "I don't know, kid, but we're stranded." Douglas's head swam, a metallic tang coating his tongue. Beside him, Lita groaned, her multiple throats vibrating with a low, pained hum. He pushed himself up, wincing as a shard of plasteel scraped against his arm. The freighter's interior was a mangled mess of sparking wires and twisted metal. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of ozone and burning lubricant. "Lita, you all right, kid?" He rasped, his voice raw. She blinked her large, iridescent eyes, focusing on him. A thin trickle of blue blood oozed from a gash on her forehead. She nodded slowly, then pointed to her leg, wincing. Douglas ran a diagnostic scan over himself, a few bruises, a possible concussion. Nothing life-threatening, but the ship. The ship was a disaster. "Comms are down," he muttered, slamming a fist against the console. No response, just a dead, flickering screen. "Life support's failing too. We've got maybe 6 hours of breathable air left." Lita tilted her head, her antennae twitching. She pointed towards the viewport, a concerned warble escaping her throat. Strange flickers danced across her eyes. Douglas frowned. "What is it?" She touched the viewport, then mimed a spiraling motion with her hand. "Energy. Strange." He activated the emergency power, diverting what little remained to the ship's scanners. The screen flickered to life, displaying a rudimentary planetary scan. A breathable atmosphere, at least, but the readout was alarming. "Corrosive rain patterns," he said grimly. "High concentrations of something. We stay out in that for too long, we're going to have a real problem." He unsealed the emergency hatch, and the two of them stepped out onto the surface. The air was thin but breathable. Before them stretched a desolate landscape unlike anything Douglas had ever seen. Jagged rock formations clawed at the sky, their peaks shrouded in swirling purple mist. Twisted, bioluminescent vegetation pulsed with an eerie internal light, casting long, dancing shadows. The ground crunched underfoot, a mixture of black sand and shattered rock. It was beautiful in a savage, unsettling way. Damn, Douglas breathed, taking in the scene. What is this place? The first drops of rain began to fall, hissing as they hit the scorched hull of the freighter. Douglas felt a stinging sensation on his exposed skin. This wasn't going to be easy. We need shelter, he said, scanning the horizon. His gaze settled on a dark opening in the base of a towering rock formation. Cave, let's go. They scavenged what they could from the wreckage: a medkit, some ration packs, a thermal blanket. Douglas slung his rifle over his shoulder, the familiar weight a small comfort in this alien world. The cave offered some respite from the elements. It was damp and cold, but at least it was out of the rain. Lita huddled near the back, her antennae twitching. Water, she warbled, pointing to a crack in the rock wall. Underground. Douglas followed her gaze. He touched the rock, feeling a faint vibration. He pulled out his multi-tool and used the sonic scanner. A faint signal echoed back. You're right, he said, impressed. Good ears, kid. He managed to rig up a makeshift collection system, catching the dripping water in a salvaged container. With the immediate needs addressed, Douglas turned his attention to the hyperdrive. He ran another diagnostic, his face growing grim. It's worse than I thought, he said, running a hand through his thinning hair. The impact sheared the regulator clean off. We need dechrysalium. It's a rare element, not something you just find lying around. He paused, thinking. Unless. While Douglas worked, Lita began to explore the cave. She gathered pieces of the bioluminescent flora, crushing them into a paste. She then began to draw on the cave walls, her small hands moving with surprising speed and skill. Douglas glanced over, intrigued. The drawings were strange. Dreamlike images of swirling galaxies, impossible creatures, and landscapes that seemed to shift and change before his eyes. Suddenly, Douglas stopped, his blood running cold. He'd found something. A crashed escape pod half buried in the black sand a few hundred yards from their freighter. ZZ Glorg. He approached cautiously, weapon raised. The pod was heavily damaged, its hull breached in multiple places. Inside, he found the pilot, or what was left of him. His exoskeleton was cracked and broken, his body desiccated. Douglas grimaced, then began to search the pod for anything useful. He found the ship's datapad, but the screen was shattered. He managed to salvage the memory core, hoping he could extract something from it. Back in the cave, Douglas connected the memory core to his multi-tool. The data was heavily corrupted, but he managed to recover a few fragmented logs. Meanwhile, Lita's drawings were glowing brighter, pulsing with an inner light. The air around them seemed to shimmer, a faint hum resonating through the cave. Douglas noticed that the drawings closest to the cave entrance were glowing the brightest. It was as if they were reacting to something outside. He frowned, a growing sense of unease settling over him. He'd been so focused on survival that he hadn't considered the bigger picture. They weren't alone. Drones, he whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. ZZ Glorg patrolled drones. He could hear the faint, high-pitched whine in the distance, growing closer. He returned to the corrupted logs he'd salvaged, racing against time. He needed to know what they were up against. He managed to piece together a partial map of the planet from the fragmented data. It pinpointed several key locations, including a potential source of dechrysalium. Lita suddenly gasped, recoiling from her drawings. Her eyes widened, filled with fear. She pointed to one of the images, a depiction of a swirling vortex of energy. Danger, she warbled, her antennae trembling. Guarded. Douglas stared at the drawing, trying to decipher its meaning. Guarded by what? Lita shuddered, then drew another image, a monstrous creature with razor-sharp claws and glowing eyes. Creature, strong, energy, a silicon-based life form, Douglas realized, a native of this planet, and it was guarding the dechrysalium. He looked at Lita, then back at her glowing drawings. An idea began to form in his mind. "Lita," he said slowly, "your art. It's affecting the energy here, isn't it?" She nodded, pointing to the protective field that shimmered around the cave entrance. "It's weakening the creature," he realized, piecing it together. "The bioluminescence. It disrupts its energy field." A silicon-based life form weakened by bioluminescence. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. "Okay, kid," he said, his voice hardening with perseverance. "Here's the plan." He outlined his strategy, explaining how they would use Lita's art to lure the creature away from the dechrysalium deposit. It was risky, but it was their only hope. As they prepared to leave the cave, they stumbled upon something else, a narrow passage leading deeper into the rock formation. Curiosity overcoming caution, Douglas activated his multi-tools light and peered into the darkness. The passage opened into a vast chamber filled with strange geometric structures. They were ancient, derelict, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings. This wasn't a natural cave. This was something else, something built. "What is this place?" Douglas murmured, awestruck. The structures were unlike anything he had ever seen. They predated both human and ZZ-Glorg civilizations. They were alien. He ran his hand over one of the carvings, feeling a faint vibration. The symbols seemed to resonate with something deep within him, a sense of familiarity. He recognized some of the symbols. He'd seen them before in his dreams. Lita approached one of the structures, her antennae twitching. She reached out and touched one of the carvings, and her eyes widened. Suddenly, her drawings began to react violently. The images on the cave walls pulsed with an intense light, projecting holographic images into the chamber. Douglas staggered back, shielding his eyes. He saw the ZZ-Glorg homeworld. But it wasn't the homeworld he knew. It was a vision of destruction, of cities crumbling and skies burning. He saw the ZZ-Glorg people fleeing in terror, their faces contorted with fear. Then the images shifted, revealing the planet they were on. It wasn't just a random world. It was a failsafe, a repository of genetic material and technology designed to preserve the ZZ-Glorg race in the event of a catastrophic collapse, a way to ensure their survival, no matter the consequences. The implications were staggering. The ZZ-Glorg knew their civilization was doomed, and they were willing to do anything to survive. The energy surge from the structure, combined with the intensified bioluminescence of Lita's art, had not gone unnoticed. The hum of the patrol drones grew louder, closer. Then, a new sound, the unmistakable whine of a ZZ-Glorg patrol ship descending from the sky. Douglas grabbed Lita, pulling her close. The ship was headed straight for them, its weapons systems charging. They had a choice to make: run and try to escape the planet, or stay and face the ZZ-Glorg, knowing what they now knew. Knowing that the fate of the ZZ-Glorg and perhaps the entire galaxy rested on their shoulders. The world dissolved into a blinding flash of emerald energy. Douglas threw himself and Lita behind the crumbling plinth as plasma bolts vaporized the already decaying stone where they'd been standing moments before. The ZZ-Glorg patrol ship, a manta-shaped vessel jam-packed with weapon emplacements, hung in the air, its energy cannons spitting death. Inside, Douglas barked, shoving Lita toward a shadowed opening in the ancient structure's base. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of destruction. He risked a glance back, firing a burst from his pulse rifle, forcing the ship to momentarily divert its fire. He knew it wouldn't hold them off for long. This wasn't a battle he could win. It was about buying time for Lita. Go deeper inside. He yelled, laying down another volley of fire before diving through the opening himself. The structure swallowed them whole, plunging them into near darkness. Douglas risked another peek outside, then sealed the entry with a makeshift barricade of fallen debris, buying them precious seconds. "This way," he said, his voice tight, pulling Lita along a narrow, winding corridor. "Stay close." He didn't know where they were going, but deeper into the structure was their only chance. He trusted his instincts, honed by years of war. He had to protect her. As Douglas created a diversion, Lita retreated deeper into the structure. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Her small hands brushed against cold, damp stone as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The rhythmic thrum of the ZZ-Glorg ship's engines faded behind her, replaced by an unsettling silence. She stumbled into a chamber, larger than the others and bathed in an ethereal blue light. In the center stood a crystalline obelisk, humming with contained power. As she approached, holographic images flickered to life around her, depicting scenes of ZZ-Glorg colonists arriving on this world centuries ago, their insectoid forms bustling with purpose as they constructed the very structure around her. The archive detailed the planet's history as a fail-safe colony, meant to preserve ZZ-Glorg culture and technology in the event of a catastrophic event on their homeworld. A chilling contingency plan. Back outside, the barricade splintered. Douglas fought like a man possessed, knowing his capture was inevitable. He emptied his pulse rifle, then drew his sidearm, taking down 2 of the insected warriors before he was finally overwhelmed. A stun blast paralyzed him, and he collapsed to the ground, his vision blurring as the ZZ-Glorg soldiers swarmed over him. He awoke strapped to a cold metal table, the harsh glare of an interrogation lamp burning into his eyes. A towering ZZ-Glorg, its chitinous armor gleaming, stood before him. Its mandibles clicked open and closed, and a guttural voice filled the room. "Human, you trespass on sacred ground. What do you know of this place?" Douglas spat on the floor. "Nothing you'd tell me if I asked." The interrogator leaned closer, its multifaceted eyes glinting with cold intelligence. "This is a fail-safe colony. A repository of our history, our knowledge. It is meant to be activated only in the event of a catastrophic event on the ZZ-Glorg homeworld, an event we believe is imminent." He paused, studying Douglas's face. "What is your purpose here, and who is the youngling?" Meanwhile, Lita, having witnessed Douglas's capture through a crack in the chamber wall, focused her mind. Images began to coalesce in the corridor outside the interrogation room, phantoms of ZZ-Glorg warriors, distorted and grotesque, lunging from the shadows. The guards, startled by the sudden apparitions, turned, weapons raised, firing blindly into the empty space. It was enough. Douglas, seizing the moment of chaos, snapped the restraints holding him to the table. He lunged at the interrogator, knocking the towering alien off balance, then grabbed a discarded energy pistol and blasted his way out of the room. He found Lita waiting for him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and tenacity. "The escape pod," he gasped. "Is it ready?" Lita shook her head. "Damaged, beyond repair." Douglas swore under his breath. Their only way off this planet was gone. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath. He had to think. Lita tugged at his sleeve. "The archive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It showed. Tunnels, underground tunnels, they connect to another place, a ZZ-Glorg place." "What kind of place?" "A research place," she replied. "Hidden." Douglas stared at her, hope flickering in his chest. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "Lead the way." The tunnels were a claustrophobic nightmare, a labyrinth of twisting passages filled with dripping water and the scuttling of unseen creatures. Mutated, bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting an eerie glow. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and something else. Something acrid and metallic. They pressed on, deeper into the earth until they reached a vast cavern. In the center stood a massive, cylindrical structure, humming with barely controlled energy. "This is it," Douglas breathed, his hand resting on his pulse rifle. "The research facility." As they crept closer, Douglas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scrawled on the walls, etched into the metal, were symbols. Equations, temporal equations. They were experimenting with temporal technology, he muttered, piecing together the fragments of information. "On this planet." The facility was heavily guarded, its perimeter patrolled by heavily armed ZZ Glorg warriors. They could try to sneak in, relying on stealth and Lita's illusions, or they could launch a full-scale assault, risking everything. As Douglas weighed their options, Lita cried out, clutching her head. Her pheromonal song was a discordant shriek. Her drawings began to swirl and pulse with energy, reacting to something within the facility. "It's the core," she gasped. "The energy core. It's reacting to my art, a feedback loop. It's going to destabilize the whole place." Time was running out. Douglas spotted a terminal partially obscured by a tangle of wires. He recognized it immediately, a distress signal beacon. Activating it would alert the entire ZZ Glorg fleet to their location, bringing down a swarm of warships. But it would also send a warning. A warning about what was happening here. He hesitated. It was a gamble, a desperate one. Lita's voice cut through his thoughts. "I see it, the homeworld, it's being consumed by a rift, a temporal rift." Her words echoed the interrogator's warning. The failsafe protocol, the impending disaster, it was all connected. Douglas made his decision. He reached for the terminal. "We have to warn them," he said, his voice firm, "even if it means." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lita knew the risks. He activated the beacon. The facility went into lockdown. Blast doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. Red lights flashed and a klaxon blared. Automated defense systems whirred to life, targeting them with deadly precision. As the energy shield sprung up, blocking their path, Lita cried out, her abilities weakening them. But as the system tried to compensate, her drawings began showing images of how to shut down the core, revealing a plan. The chaos was also guiding her. Shutting down the core, however, would also disable the failsafe protocol. If the temporal rift consumed the ZZ Glorg homeworld, there would be no escape, no backup. The lockdown intensified. Another patrol ship arrived at the facility, its engines roaring as it touched down, cutting off any avenue of escape. They were trapped. Then the ground began to tremble. The air shimmered. A tier in reality ripped open above them, a swirling vortex of colors that defied description. The temporal rift Lita saw in her vision had manifested. The planet was beginning to unravel. The facility bucked like a wild beast beneath them. Metal screamed, and the air shimmered with visible distortions as the temporal rift intensified. Douglas grabbed Lita, pulling her close as a section of the ceiling peeled away, showering them with sparks. "Hold on," he yelled, his voice barely audible above the din. Lita pointed to her drawing, now vibrating violently against the wall. "Energy. Defense. Junction," she managed to convey, her pheromonal echoes tinged with urgency. Douglas followed her gaze, spotting a schematic of the facility. "Damn it, she's right. We need to reroute the power from the defense grid to shut this thing down." A low rumble vibrated through the floor, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a landing ship. "Company's here," Douglas growled, drawing his sidearm. "And they don't look happy." The patrol ship's ramp slammed down and a squad of heavily armored ZZ Glorg soldiers poured into the corridor, their chitinous bodies clicking and whirring. "Intruders, secure the facility." Their leader barked in guttural ZZ Glorg. "Lita, move." Douglas shoved her behind a toppled console, firing a burst of plasma that sent the ZZ Glorg scrambling for cover. He laid down suppressing fire, giving them a chance to escape. "Gotta slow them down," he muttered, tossing a smoke grenade into the corridor. As the smoke billowed, obscuring their movements, Lita touched the wall and several shimmering holographic duplicates of themselves flickered into existence, running in different directions. The ZZ Glorg soldiers, momentarily confused, opened fire on the illusions. "Nice work, kid," Douglas said, grabbing her hand and pulling her through a maintenance tunnel. "That'll buy us some time." They reached the junction box, a large metal panel humming with power, guarded by 2 ZZ Glorg soldiers and a shimmering energy shield. "Shielded," Douglas cursed. "We can't get through that." Lita stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the energy shield. She began to hum, a series of complex pheromonal vibrations that resonated with the air. Her hands moved rapidly, creating swirling patterns of light on a nearby wall. "What are you doing?" Douglas asked, glancing nervously at the approaching ZZ Glorg. "Disrupt," she replied, her voice strained. "Conflicting. Patterns." Douglas understood. She was trying to use her art to create an interference pattern that would overload the shield. But it required intense concentration, leaving her completely vulnerable. He gripped his weapon tighter. "I got you, kid. Just focus." The energy shield flickered and sputtered as Lita's patterns intensified. The ZZ Glorg soldiers noticed the disruption and opened fire. Douglas returned fire, taking down one soldier and forcing the other to take cover. Plasma bolts whizzed past his head as he fought to protect Lita. With a final surge of energy, Lita's patterns coalesced, and the energy shield shattered, leaving the junction box exposed. "Now," she gasped, collapsing against the wall. Douglas didn't hesitate. He rushed to the junction box and began rerouting the energy flow, his fingers flying across the control panel. Alarms blared and the facility shuddered again. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the air. Small, metallic drones swarmed out of hidden compartments, their red eyes glowing menacingly. "Security drones!" Douglas yelled, firing at the closest one. The drones were fast and agile, dodging his shots and returning fire with laser beams. He and Lita ducked for cover, trying to evade the relentless attacks. He grabbed an Ithorian pulse weapon from a fallen guard and handed it to Lita. "Can you use this?" One of the drones hovered closer, its sensors scanning the core. Douglas noticed a small device attached to its underside. "Wait, that's a self-destruct," he realized, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's designed to blow if we tamper with the core." He remembered one of Lita's earlier drawings, a schematic of the core's shield generator. An idea sparked in his mind. "Lita, can you see the shield in your drawings? Is there a weak point?" She nodded, her eyes widening. "Top, disrupt, pattern." "Okay," Douglas said, grabbing the drone with his free hand. "We're going to reprogram you." He quickly accessed the drone's control panel, his fingers dancing across the keys. "Target, core shield, disrupt pattern, engage." The drone's red eyes flickered to green and it shot towards the core, slamming into the energy shield with a deafening explosion. The shield flickered and died, leaving the core exposed. But even as the alarms intensified, Lita's pheromonal song shifted, becoming a dirge of sorrow. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Fail safe. Chain reaction. Homeworld." Douglas froze, his hand hovering over the final control. "What do you mean, chain reaction?" "Shut down. Here. Destroy. There," she struggled to explain, pointing towards the stars. Douglas felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He knew what she meant. Shutting down the core might save them from the immediate temporal rift, but it could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction that would devastate the ZZ Glorg homeworld. He was torn. Could he risk the lives of billions to save himself and Lita? He looked at Lita, her eyes pleading with him. He thought of the countless lives already lost in this war. He thought of Thrax, a leader secretly yearning for peace. He made his decision. "We have to trust that we can find another way," he said, his voice firm. "We can't let fear paralyze us." He slammed his hand down on the control. The energy redirection was complete. A klaxon blared and heavy metal doors slammed shut, sealing off the core chamber. They were trapped. The facility began a system reboot, the lights flickering and dimming. "No, the drawings." Douglas realized, his voice filled with despair. The reboot would wipe Lita's art, their plan, everything. Outside the chamber, the temporal rift began expanding rapidly, consuming the facility. Lita, using the last of her energy, pressed her hand against the wall and began to draw, her fingers moving frantically. When she was done, she collapsed, exhausted. On the wall was a series of complex symbols, unintelligible to Douglas. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with desperation. "Coordinates," she whispered. "Teleporter. Homeworld." Douglas stared at the symbols, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. A teleporter to the ZZ-Glorg homeworld. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The coordinates locked. A high-pitched whine filled the cramped chamber, building to an unbearable crescendo. Then, a flash. A blinding, all-consuming white that ripped through Douglas's vision. He felt his body disassemble, atom by atom, only to be reassembled an instant later. The sensation was akin to being turned inside out, then forced through a needle's eye. He gasped, his lungs burning, and stumbled, catching himself on something cold and metallic. The air stank of ozone and oil. Towering structures of dull gray metal scraped against a sky choked with smog. The ground vibrated beneath his boots, a constant tremor from unseen machinery. He was no longer in the sterile confines of the outpost. This was a ZZ-Glorg world. Lita coughed, clutching at his leg. Her large eyes, wide with fear, darted around. This industrial zone was a cacophony of clanking metal, hissing steam, and the rhythmic skittering of countless insectoid workers. Drones shaped like metallic wasps patrolled overhead, their multifaceted eyes glinting in the dim light. "We need to move," Douglas muttered, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. The air thrummed with a low, almost subsonic hum, making his teeth ache. He scanned the area, his military training kicking in. Patrol patterns, blind spots, potential escape routes. The drones followed predictable paths, their sensors likely focused on heat signatures and movement. He pointed to a cluster of massive pipes, their surfaces corroded and leaking. "There. We can use those for cover." They moved quickly, hugging the shadows. The ZZ-Glorg workers, their chitinous bodies glistening with oil, paid them no mind. They were cogs in a vast machine, their movements precise and repetitive, their faces devoid of expression. The rigid hierarchy and utilitarian nature of this society were a stark contrast to anything Douglas had ever experienced. Even the worst human regimes had a degree of chaotic inefficiency. This was cold, calculated, and utterly alien. Lita tugged at his sleeve, her brow furrowed. He knelt down, trying to understand what she was trying to convey. She pressed her small hand against the metal of a nearby container, then shivered. "What is it?" he asked, knowing she couldn't understand him. She pointed to the container, then to her head, her eyes widening. A disturbance, a ripple in the air. She could sense something he couldn't. Temporal instability. He guessed, remembering her earlier warnings. She nodded vigorously, her antennae twitching. The instability was growing stronger, more urgent. They continued, weaving through the maze of machinery. As they rounded a corner, they came across a group of ZZ-Glorg workers huddled together, their bodies trembling. Their usually precise movements were jerky and uncoordinated. Some clutched at their heads, emitting high-pitched clicking sounds of distress. The temporal anomalies were having a direct impact. Douglas approached cautiously, his weapon raised but not aimed. "Are you all right?" he asked, knowing they wouldn't understand. The workers recoiled, their multifaceted eyes filled with fear and suspicion. They chittered amongst themselves, their mandibles clicking menacingly. They saw him as a threat, an outsider. Propaganda, he realized. Fear was a powerful weapon. Lita stepped forward, her small frame a stark contrast to the towering workers. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a piece of scrap metal. With quick, deft movements, she began to scratch an image into its surface. A circle. Within the circle, swirling lines of energy, contained and stable. A visual representation of a stable temporal field. She held it out to the workers. The effect was immediate. The chittering subsided. The trembling lessened. The workers stared at the image, their fear slowly replaced by a glimmer of hope. The art, once again, transcending the language barrier. One of the workers, an elder ZZ-Glorg with faded chitin and clouded eyes, reached out a trembling claw and gently took the metal fragment. He examined it closely, then looked at Lita with something akin to understanding. He emitted a series of low clicks, then pointed to a dark alleyway between two massive structures. Douglas frowned. What did he say? Lita touched Douglas's hand and projected an image. Hidden, way, the elder beckoned them forward. Resistance, Lita projected. Oppose, Thrax. A hidden resistance movement, another layer of complexity, another glimmer of hope. The elder led them to a concealed panel in the side of one of the structures. He manipulated a series of levers and the panel slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel. Transport, Lita projected. Capital, city, danger, Thrax, security. The elder clicked again, his tone urgent. The tunnel led to a hidden transport system, a secret route to the heart of the ZZ-Glorg capital, but Thrax's security measures were ruthless. As they entered the tunnel, Lita touched Douglas's arm again. This time the image was different, a swirling vortex of darkness, a figure writhing in internal conflict. Thrax, Lita projected, her voice barely a whisper. Pain, doubt, hidden. Thrax, the supreme commander, was not immune to the horrors of the war. He harbored doubts hidden deep within his hardened exterior. What Douglas learned earlier was being reinforced. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, filled with a network of suspended platforms and automated transports. They boarded a small, open-topped vehicle, and it sped off into the darkness. The capital city was a nightmare of sharp angles and dark materials. Towering skyscrapers, built from obsidian-like stone, pierced the smog-choked sky. The streets were crowded with ZZ-Glorg citizens, their movements regimented and their faces grim. The entire city reeked of militarism and oppression. As they emerged onto a busy thoroughfare, a drone spotted them. Its multifaceted eyes focused on Douglas and Lita, then emitted a piercing shriek. Security forces swarmed. Run! Douglas yelled, grabbing Lita's hand. They sprinted through the crowded streets, dodging the insected citizens who scattered in panic. The security forces, their chitinous bodies clad in black armor, were relentless in their pursuit. They ducked into a narrow alleyway, hoping to lose our pursuers. But the security forces were closing in. They burst into a large open space. Before them was a large, unassuming door. A symbol was above the door, a circle of harmony. Sanctuary, Lita projected. Douglas shoved the door open and pulled Lita inside. The door slammed shut behind them. The interior was a stark contrast to the harsh city outside. Soft lighting illuminated walls adorned with intricate artwork. ZZ-Glorg philosophers and artists sat in quiet contemplation, their faces serene. The leader of the sanctuary, a ZZ-Glorg with gentle eyes and a kind smile, approached them. Lita projected a message. Peace. Help. Thrax. The leader nodded. We know of your mission. We share your desire. He led them to a holographic projector. We will help you create a message, a plea for peace. They worked quickly, assembling Lita's artwork into a holographic display. The message was simple: an end to the war, a return to harmony, a future of peace. It was to be broadcast during a major public event, a celebration of ZZ-Glorg military might. But their hope was short-lived. A deafening crash echoed through the sanctuary. The doors splintered. Thrax's forces swarmed in, their weapons raised. They found us, Douglas yelled. Run! The sanctuary was raided. The artists and philosophers were rounded up. Hope turned to ashes. Douglas grabbed Lita's hand and they fled once more, their dream of peace slipping away. They were back on the streets, hunted and desperate. We have to get the message out, Douglas said, his voice grim. Somehow. He scanned the surroundings, his mind racing. A distraction. They needed a distraction. I have an idea, he said, a spark of dedication in his eyes. But it's risky. He planted a small explosive device near a major intersection, timing it to detonate just as a convoy of Thrax's forces approached. The explosion ripped through the air, creating chaos and confusion. The security forces diverted their attention to the blast, giving Douglas and Lita a window of opportunity. Now. Douglas yelled. He activated a small transmitter and aimed it at Thrax's personal communication channel, bypassing the heavily guarded public network. Lita began to transmit the holographic message, her small hands trembling. The message went through. Thrax received it. His multifaceted eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. Then his expression hardened. "Capture them," he snarled into his communicator, "and execute those traitors in the sanctuary." Lita gasped, clutching at Douglas. "Temporal surge," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "Thrax, weapon, massive." A massive temporal surge was emanating from Thrax's location. He was using the temporal energy to power a weapon. A weapon with unimaginable destructive potential. The situation had just gone from bad to catastrophic. Thrax stood rigid, his chitinous armor gleaming under the dim light of the chamber. But beneath the surface, a tremor ran through him, a subtle vibration in his mandibles betraying the turmoil within. Lita's message, a simple drawing of a flower offered as a gesture of peace, had struck a chord, echoing with the faint, forgotten melodies of his own lost childhood on a world before the war. A world he barely remembered. Guards seized Douglas and Lita, their rough hands surprisingly gentle. They were led through a maze of corridors to a vast chamber where Thrax awaited on a raised platform. The air hummed with barely suppressed aggression, the scent of ozone and anticipation thick in the air. Thrax's multifaceted eyes, like polished obsidian, fixed on Lita, assessing, calculating. "Human," he rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant drone that vibrated in Douglas's chest. "And, Youngling, why have you come?" Lita, despite the obvious fear etched on her small Ithorian face, stepped forward. She held out a new drawing, crafted from scraps of metal and pigment scavenged from the outpost. It depicted a future, Glorg and humans, not as warriors but as neighbors, tending gardens beneath twin suns. As Thrax gazed upon the image, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He staggered, his grip tightening on the armrests of his command throne. A hallucination, vivid and horrifying, erupted in his mind. He saw countless faces, Glorg and human alike, their eyes vacant, their bodies broken, all sacrificed on the altar of endless war. The screams of the dying echoed in his skull, a cacophony of pain and regret. "The temporal weapon will ensure our dominance," a lieutenant hissed, breaking Thrax from his vision. "The human colonies will be erased, their resources ours." Thrax turned, his gaze hardening, but the lieutenant could not see the turmoil in his mind. The temporal weapon, he knew, was not simply a tool of conquest. It was fueled by something far more sinister, the collective pain and aggression of the Glorg people, a cycle of violence perpetuated through generations, each atrocity feeding the next, a dark inheritance. Lita, sensing Thrax's anguish, reached out a small, trembling hand and touched his leg. Her other mouth opened, and a wave of harmonious sound washed over the chamber, a complex Ithorian pheromonal song. Douglas didn't understand the words, but he felt the emotion, empathy, forgiveness, a plea for understanding that transcended language. The effect on Thrax was immediate. He recoiled as if burned, his multifaceted eyes widening in disbelief. The weight of centuries of hatred, the burden of command, the crushing despair of endless war, all of it threatened to overwhelm him. But within that chaos, a spark of something new ignited, a flicker of hope, a whisper of peace. With a guttural roar that echoed through the chamber, Thrax lunged forward and seized the controls of the temporal weapon. Ignoring the horrified cries of his officers, he redirected the weapon's energy inward, focusing it on himself. A blinding light filled the chamber, followed by an eerie silence. Thrax collapsed, his massive frame crumpling to the floor. His mind, once a fortress of strategic brilliance and unyielding aggression, was now a blank slate, cleansed of the hatred that had consumed him for so long. The memories of war, the ingrained prejudices, the thirst for conquest, all erased. The Glorg officers stared in stunned silence. Their supreme commander, the embodiment of their warrior ethos, lay broken, his mind seemingly shattered. But as they looked closer, they saw something else. A profound peace in his expression, a serenity they had never witnessed before. Doubt crept into their hearts, a questioning of their own motives, a reevaluation of the purpose of the war. Douglas stepped forward, his voice surprisingly steady. "We have all lost too much," he said, his words translated by the outpost's universal translator. "The war ends now. Lay down your weapons. Join us in building a new future, a future of peace, of understanding, of shared prosperity." One by one, the Glorg soldiers lowered their weapons. The metallic clang of discarded rifles echoed through the chamber, a symphony of surrender. The Galactic War, a conflict that had raged for generations, was finally over. In the aftermath, Thrax, now a peaceful leader, guided by a newfound sense of compassion, worked alongside Douglas and Lita. Together, they forged a new era of cooperation between the Glorg and humanity, establishing trade routes, cultural exchange programs, and joint research initiatives. Lita's art became a symbol of peace throughout the galaxy, her simple drawings inspiring other species to overcome their differences and embrace unity. Her flower, once a simple sketch, became a galactic emblem. Douglas, transformed by his experiences, dedicated his life to fostering interspecies relations, traveling from world to world, sharing his story and promoting understanding. He found a new purpose, a new sense of belonging,